This is BBC News. We're interrupting our schedules for the following announcement. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. A statement from the palace said, "The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow." This is BBC News. Normal programmes have been suspended because of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. A statement issued by Buckingham Palace a few minutes ago said, "The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow."
Thank you, Chris. You're listening to BBC News, broadcasting on the UK across all our networks in the UK and around the world following the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. This is Michelle Hussein with Evan Davis here in the studio. And if you're just joining us, Buckingham Palace has just announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The palace's statement said that the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort, they said, will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow. So that's the news that we had just in the last few minutes after several hours of reporting the public statements earlier in the day about the health of the Queen, that Buckingham Palace had said that her doctors were concerned. And then we knew in the last few hours that members of her family, all four of her children and Prince William, her grandson, the Duke of Cambridge, had all travelled to be with her at Balmoral, and that is where they were before this announcement was made. Well, our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond, has been covering this throughout. Balmoral is a place that was special to her, Johnny.
It was special to her. It was a place of enormous peace and tranquility to the Queen, a place where she spent all her summers, long summers there, a place of privacy, a place of family, and a remote place as well for a woman who spent her life in the public eye as really no other figure of the 20th and 21st century has done. And with this 26-word statement, this briefest of statements from Palace, an era has come to a close.
Indeed, Johnny, the royal family's official website carries the message Queen Elizabeth II, 1926 to 2022, along with that official statement that we've been giving you.
It's not just a life that has come to a close, Evan. It is an era and also a way of life, because a life of service has come to an end. A life, it should be said, that the Queen was not actually born to. She was not born to succeed to the throne, and she did not choose to either. But at 25 years old, it came to her, and she gave her life to it in a way that is perhaps inconceivable to any except those who lived through the war that forged her sense of service. We'll hear the word service and duty many times in the next few hours and days, but she was the exemplar of service. And with her passing, we will not see that kind of sacrifice, that sense of service again.
People will be absorbing this news, of course, in this country, right across this country, and indeed in many other parts of the world as well. It's a long, long life. She was 96 years old. It's an extraordinary dedication to duty over the course of that entire reign. And even several of her prime ministers were born after the beginning of her reign. So for most people in this country, this will be the only monarch that they've ever known.
Yes, I mean, for most people in this country, and of course, as you mentioned, Michelle, for many people in the countries over which she is their monarch as well, or I should say, was their monarch. She was Queen of Australia, of Canada, of New Zealand. They had her too, and it was service to them that she gave as well. And there will be equal sense of shock and mourning and surprise and disappointment at her passing.
Well, just to say, you were listening to BBC News, a special programme on the announcement of the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Let's hear a little bit of her own voice now. She acceded to the throne February 1952. She became, obviously, Britain's longest reigning monarch in September 2015, that was. And in 2022, this year, she marked 70 years on the throne, a symbol of stability and continuity in a world that has changed much, and her life, of course, underpinned by devotion to duty, fulfilling a promise she made on her 21st birthday in 1947.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
In 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Philip, Prince of Greece, who would remain her consort and a source of support for the rest of his life. It was fewer than 5 years after her wedding that her father, King George VI, died. The Queen's coronation in June 1953 was memorably the first to be broadcast on television. It drew an audience of millions.
God crown you with a crown of glory and righteousness, that having a right faith and manifold fruit of good works, you may obtain the crown of an everlasting kingdom by the gift of him whose kingdom endureth forever. Amen.
Well, until 2021, of course, the Queen had Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, by her side, her husband of 73 years. And of course, at their golden wedding anniversary in 1997, she made clear how grateful she was for his long-lasting support.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim or we shall ever know.
At moments of national crisis throughout her long reign, the Queen offered words of unity and hope to the nation, most recently in her broadcast during the coronavirus lockdown in 2020.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
2020. And then, of course, in June 2022, the Queen reached her Platinum Jubilee. In the celebrations, Prince Charles spoke of her long years of service as photographs of the Queen lit the walls of Buckingham Palace behind him.
Your Majesty, Mummy, you have met us and talked with us. You laugh and cry with us. And most importantly, you have been there for us for these 70 years. You pledged to serve your whole life. You continue to deliver. That is why we are here. That is what we celebrate tonight. These pictures on your house are the story of your life and ours. So, Your Majesty, that is why we all say thank you.
A moment from the Platinum Jubilee celebrations only a few months ago, and we are expecting a written statement from the King, as he now is, very soon. We've also seen the lectern appear in Downing Street, so we are expecting to hear the Prime Minister speak, and we will go to that live as soon as she does. But Robert Hardman, author of many books on the Queen and the royal family, most recently Queen of Our Times, joins us now. Robert, we've talked so often about the Queen and her contribution. Listening to the now King speak at the Platinum Jubilee, it feels as if that was her farewell to us and ours to her.
Well, Michelle, I mean, it's very hard to sort of sum up, I think, what we all feel right now. But I think in his words there, the Prince of Wales as he was, King Charles as he is now, summed it up. You know, her story is the story of our lives, all our lives. She has been this constant. I mean, almost no one, with the exception of some very elderly people, can remember a time when she wasn't on the coins or on the stamps or on our screens on Christmas Day. Or, you know, we would turn to her at times of great crisis, but also times of great celebration. She was always there. And I think the prospect of life with this enormous gaping hole in the national landscape, it is going to take. It really will take some getting used to. And I think, you know, you also there we heard reference to Prince Philip and the important part, the vital part he played in the longest reign in our history. And her famous lines, of course, was, you know, he was her strength and stay. Well, I think the same applies to her.
And her death coming, less than 18 months after his. We shouldn't forget she's our head of state. She's also head of state of more than a dozen other countries and, of course, head of the Commonwealth. But she was also a mother, and her 4 children who are there at Balmoral have lost their mother little over a year after losing their father. They both had long, full lives, but we should think of that and the personal loss for them.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. It's first and foremost a you know, great family sadness. I mean, it's a bereavement. Yes, of course, she was the longest longest reigning monarch in our history, but it was still sort of unthinkable in a way. You know, she's been such a constant, and so if that's how we're feeling, imagine how they are feeling. And that is, you know, first and foremost, that our thoughts go to the family. But as you say, I mean, the whole world will be reverberating tonight. Yes, there are 14 other countries of which she's head of state. She's head of state, or was head of state, of course, of more of the Earth's surface than any other head of state. And over and above that, the Commonwealth, now 56 nations, nearly a third of the world's population are members of the Commonwealth, to which she devoted her life. But I think just far beyond that. I mean, I'm quite sure that in countries over which she had no jurisdiction, who owed her no allegiance, countries which probably don't even speak English, they'll still be feeling that there's this great loss, this figure who was on the throne before half the countries on Earth today even existed in their present form. The only person in history who's met and known 14 US presidents. I mean, no one in America's ever done that. You know, she is just this thread that runs through the post-war story of this nation and many others, and it's why she really will go down as one of the very greats.
Yes, born nearly a century ago. Extraordinary change that she has seen and in the course of her reign in this country and beyond.
Someone was mentioning the Queen has reigned for more than a quarter of the life of the United States. An extraordinary period of change in the world. We've, of course, been seeing lots and lots of reaction come in. We're expecting Liz Truss to say some words in Downing Street. The lectern is there. From the White House, after learning of Queen Elizabeth's death, it says thoughts go to the Queen's family, the family members, and to the UK people. Canada's Governor-General said, we offer our deepest condolences to the royal family on the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, pays tribute to the Queen's grace, dignity and dedication. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has tweeted, the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth is a profoundly sad moment for the UK, the Commonwealth and the world. Her life was one of extraordinary dedication and service. On behalf of the people of Scotland, I convey my deepest condolences to the King and the royal family. John Major, former Prime Minister, for 70 years, Her Majesty the Queen devoted her life to the service of our nation, its well-being. At this moment of deep sadness, I believe we all stand hand in hand with the royal family as they grieve the loss of one so loved. Well, I'm only reading you some of the messages that are flowing in. I can't really quite keep up with them even. Prime Minister Modi of India, Queen Elizabeth II will be remembered as a stalwart of our times, provided inspiring leadership to her nation and people.
And we are expecting to hear from Prime Minister Liz Truss very shortly in Downing Street. Johnny Diamond is with us here. Johnny, let's look back on this life, because she was not born to be Queen, which actually seems pretty extraordinary when you think of how well she seemed to fit this role to which she dedicated her life.
Yes, and perhaps that came about partly because it was so early in her life that she took on the role. She was, as you say, not meant to be Queen. That came about as a result of the abdication, her father becoming king. He died much earlier than many people expected, and just at the age of 25, she became Queen. She had barely lived a royal tour, and very little in the way of a youth, because of so much of that was spent in the war at Windsor in these extraordinary circumstances, a war that really did define her. But so quickly she became a monarch that was, yes, loved, certainly, by some, respected by so many. And over those decades, so rarely put a foot wrong. And you might say, look, a lot of the job was ceremonial, a lot of the job was, set out for her. But there were many, many opportunities when the wrong thing could have been said, the wrong approach might have been taken. There were delicate affairs of state. There was how she might respond to various different accidents of fate. And yet it is on the fingers of one hand that you can find errors and mistakes over 7 long decades of service.
It's very interesting, Johnny. I was talking to a historian who made the point that because her life has coincided with the rise of photography, recording, film, there is no person in history, in human history, whose life will have been recorded from a very young age through to their end. No president of the United States, no pope, nobody who will have had a life that has been followed as closely as Queen Elizabeth.
And she understood so well the power of image, but also the importance of distance. Because yes, she was in the photographic age and in the age of radio, but perhaps sort of most outstandingly, she was in the age of television. It was television that would take her into so many homes, and yet she never gave an interview. She understood entirely that the mystique of monarchy in her eyes had to be protected from intrusion. There would be the odd informal discussion with a friend or a confidant that might be recorded, but very little else apart from that. And that distance kept her in the eye of the public, but somehow out of its understanding as well.
Johnny, thank you. Just a reminder, you are listening to BBC News, broadcasting on all our networks across the UK and around the world as well, following the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Buckingham Palace said that she died peacefully at Balmoral, which was her home in Scotland, earlier this afternoon. And we know that the King, Prince Charles, as he was, is there with her, along with the Queen's other children and her grandson, Prince William, as well. So that is the news that we had in the last 30 minutes, nearly 30 minutes now. And Lorna Gordon, our correspondent, has been at Balmoral through the afternoon. Lorna, what can you tell us? It's some time ago now that we saw members of the family arrive, and subsequent to that, we had this statement.
Yes, an entourage, a cavalcade, a motorcade of members of the royal family arrived here at Balmoral approximately 2 hours ago. Prince William driving one of the cars that swept into the main gates. This is ordinarily a very quiet part of northeast Scotland, extremely rural, surrounded by hills and heather. But since the news has come through that Her Majesty the Queen has died, the crowds have started to gather here on this narrow country road. I would estimate between 40 to 50 members of the public are here. Some are in tears, others are hugging each other. Some arrived to wish her family well and arrived to the news that the Queen had died. They were shocked. People here are sad. They have a very close relationship, many people here, to the Queen. One lady told me that she would wave at members of the royal family as they passed by in their cars. Others have told me that they viewed the Queen as a neighbour, hugely protective of her and her family, and tremendously sad at the news that has just come through that the Queen has died here as well.
So they would have seen her, Lorna, local people would have seen her summer after summer?
Yes, she has a long relationship with this area and the neighbouring villages of Braemar and Ballater. Her and her family, regular visitors to the area. The Queen has spent most summers here since she was a child. She has a great deal of privacy when she comes to the estate. When she came to the estate, it is secluded, it is secure, it covers 50,000 acres of moorland and hills. She would often go for walks in the nearby mountains. Members of the public would pass her and on occasion chat to her and her security detail. The family was said to hold barbecues here. Every year the Queen would hold a ball as well, which members of the public and neighbours and friends would attend. It is an area which she was extremely fond of and is said by many to have considered the place where she was most comfortable. So there is some poignancy that this place where she felt most at home was the place where she got to spend these final days. And of course those pictures just a couple of days ago, not ordinarily a place where she would carry out official duties. This is a private residence here, but even towards this very end of this long reign, she was carrying out that unusual greeting of the incoming and outgoing prime ministers. And then, of course, there was due to be the Privy Council remote meeting last night, which was cancelled, which was perhaps that first indication that all was not well. But it is a private residence. It is a place where, in the past, she's been able to relax, be with her family, enjoy the Scottish countryside, and this is where her family, her close family today, have gathered.
Lorna, thank you very much. That's Lorna Gordon outside Balmoral.
Yes, and we are just getting so much reaction now. New Zealand has hailed the extraordinary late Queen and proclaims the King as new head of state. Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau, the Queen was a constant presence in their lives, and her service to Canadians will forever remain an important part of our country's history. It's coming up now to 7 o'clock, and you're listening to a BBC News special. This is a special... This is BBC News with Michelle Hussein and Evan Davis, and we're marking the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We will be remembering the Queen's life and hearing from those who've observed her close up, her long reign. But here now is Chris Aldridge with a summary of what we've heard in the last few minutes.
In the past half hour, Buckingham Palace has announced that the Queen has died. In a statement, the palace said that the Queen, who was 96, died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. Flags at Buckingham Palace and at Downing Street have been lowered to half-mast as a mark of respect. Earlier this afternoon, all 4 of the Queen's children travelled to Balmoral, where she had been staying since July, after her doctors raised concerns about her health. Prince William is also at the estate, and Prince Harry is travelling there separately. Buckingham Palace said the new King and Queen Consort would remain at Balmoral this evening before returning to London tomorrow. Britain will now enter a period of national mourning. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said her life had been one of extraordinary dedication and service. The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davies, said the Queen had served our country faithfully all her life and was loved the world over. The former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, said she had been an example of duty and leadership for so very many years, and we had all lost someone very precious to us. His successor as Prime Minister, Sir Tony Blair, said the UK had lost not just its monarch, but the matriarch of the nation, who more than any other brought the country together. Gordon Brown said the Queen had served the country to the last. The leader of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, called her a shining light in our history. Tributes to the Queen are coming in from around the world. The French President Emmanuel Macron said that throughout her reign, Elizabeth II had been a friend of France. The President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, said she was truly Queen Elizabeth the Great.
Chris, thank you. Chris Aldridge, you're listening to a BBC News special with me, Michelle Hussein, and with Evan Davis to mark the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The statement from Buckingham Palace earlier on said that the Queen had died peacefully at Balmoral, and that was after a statement earlier in the day saying that her doctors had become concerned, and then we saw members of the Queen's immediate family travel to Balmoral before the news was formally announced within the last half hour. Well, she had a long reign. She was on the throne for 70 years. That moment was marked at the Platinum Jubilee celebrations earlier this year. Our special correspondent Jim Naughtie is here with us, having covered and reflected on many such occasions over the years. Jim, you can see, of course, many tributes. There is sorrow, but there is also immense respect, admiration and affection being expressed.
I think that's true, Michelle. There will be a lot of sorrow, but there will also be a lot of calm reflection on the profound nature of this life and what it's meant for the country. For 3 generations, the stability at the heart of the country in a time of extraordinary turbulence. Soon after when the Queen came to the throne, rationing after the Second World War was still in place. Churchill was Prime Minister. The upheavals of the 50s and rebuilding the country after war and through the 40s and 50s. The upheavals of the 60s, social, the end of the age of deference, all these fantastic social shifts. And at the centre of it, this still, calm, resolute person who somehow embodied the history that had to be remembered, the continuity that had to be represented, and was able to reflect that, I think, to people who wouldn't wake up every morning thinking about the monarchy or anything else. Perhaps some who didn't like it, some who even wanted to overturn it. But for, I think, the country as a whole, she was an extraordinary rock of steadiness at the centre of it all. And even when her family was riven by distressing marriage breakups, which any family would find very difficult to surmount, she seemed to be able to sail through personal difficulties in exactly the same way as she kind of took on all the changes, all the upheavals, whether they were political or economic, in the country, and kind of absorb them and reflect back something which suggested that there was a continuity underneath that would continue. And, I was up at Balmoral earlier in the week to watch that rather strange handover of power from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss, where they were driving through that sort of monsoon to go into Balmoral and be one to relieve seals of office and the other to receive them and kiss hands with the Queen. And at the time I was struck by the way that this momentous event was also very intimate. And that was the ability that she had, I think, to the country to reflect a personal intimacy and connection with the country and its history while carrying out the duties with all the kind of steadfastness that Johnny Diamond was expressing and describing so movingly a few minutes ago.
Only 48 hours ago with those 2 prime ministers. Johnny?
Michelle, we've just received a statement from the new king, and it comes out of Buckingham Palace, a statement from His Majesty the King at the time of the Queen's death, and it reads, "The death of my beloved mother, Her Majesty the Queen, is a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all members of my family. We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms and the Commonwealth, and by countless people around the world. During this period of mourning and change, my family and I will be comforted and sustained by our knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held." That statement, the first words from the new king.
And we're all going to be getting used to king, not queen. It's a very, very, for most of us, a very unfamiliar language, isn't it? We have also a statement from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. "May Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II rest in peace and rise in glory. As she had done before, she reminded us of a deep truth about ourselves. We're a people of hope who care for one another." We are keeping an eye on Downing Street. We're expecting Liz Truss to come out and make a statement. But let's go back to the Queen herself and that symbol of stability and continuity in a changing world. Her life underpinned by the devotion to duty that we heard the Archbishop refer to, fulfilling a promise she made on her 21st birthday in 1947.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Well, the Queen, not born to be Queen. Her father came to the throne when she was 10, after her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated in order to marry the divorced American Wallis Simpson. We think, actually, we're going to go to Downing Street. We believe Liz Truss is going to come out. The podium is there. The lectern is there. I'm watching the door. She's not come out yet.
But we've had lots of statements already from former prime ministers, one after another. Sir John Major.
Yeah, and here comes Liz Truss. Here comes Liz Truss. She's in black, approaching the lectern. You'll hear the photographers. Let's hear the words of Prime Minister Liz Truss.
We are all devastated by the news that we've just heard from Balmoral. The death of Her Majesty the Queen is a huge shock to the nation and to the world. Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. Her life of service stretched beyond most of our living memories. In return, she was loved and admired by the people in the United Kingdom and all around the world. She has been a personal inspiration to me and to many Britons. Her devotion to duty is an example to us all. Earlier this week, at 96, she remained determined to carry out her duties as she appointed me as her 15th Prime Minister. Throughout her life, she's visited more than 100 countries, and she has touched the lives of millions around the world. In the difficult days ahead, we will come together with our friends across the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth and the world to celebrate her extraordinary lifetime of service. It is a day of great loss, but Queen Elizabeth II leaves a great legacy. Today, the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty, King Charles III. With the King's family, we mourn the loss of his mother, and as we mourn, we must come together as a people to support him, to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
Well, there's trust there. Could she have imagined she would be making that statement days after kissing hands with the Queen at Balmoral and becoming Prime Minister? She said, "We're all devastated. It is a shock to the nation. Queen Elizabeth, the rock on which modern Britain was built, a personal inspiration, the spirit of Great Britain, loved and admired." Also there, talking of the handover. King Charles III, Her Majesty King Charles III, she said, to whom we offer our loyalty and devotion. Johnny is still with me. Johnny, until the coronation, do we know... this is something that none of us have experienced. Kings can call themselves a different name to their birth name, correct?
Yes,
they can be whatever they want.
They can, and that's why until this point we have not actually referred to the new king by the name King Charles, until this point where we heard from the Prime Minister there. And this occurred as the Queen was told of her father's death in 1952 when she was in Kenya, and she was asked by which name she would like to be known, and she said, "Well, my own, of course." But it is a question. Not all kings and queens do take their own names. No, indeed. But
so what would
decided.
You might say Charles the King rather than King Charles III at this point if you didn't know what.
I suppose you could go. You could go down that path. I've just been going with the King, but yes, but it does seem that the Prime Minister is knows something that we don't, and has and is now going to be King Charles.
Johnny, this is obviously an enormously big moment for the nation. It is going to lead to really a period of reflection, isn't it? And a period in which all sorts of questions about the country will be asked as we remember Her Majesty in the period over which she has reigned. We should reflect on that. It is going to be quite a period now.
Yeah, I think it will be, and I think the royal household has known that for some time. I mean, the first thing which occurs is this. The passing of the Queen is also the passing of our last living link to the Second World War, the war in which she served, albeit briefly, in the armed forces, and the war which she has constantly remembered, the war that forged her sense of service and her idea of service and her championing of service. And that, to some degree now, we have lost that link. But across the spectrum, we will see, I think, an examination and a thinking about the institutions of the country, to some degree, the values of the country. And that perhaps is why we heard there from the Prime Minister this idea of the continuity of the Crown as well, that whilst there is now this jarring change, there is also the continuity of the new king, of the nation offering him loyalty and support at this time, and that the ideas of the Queen carry forward into the new reign.
Indeed.
Johnny, thank you for now. Let's turn to Rose Hudson-Wilkin, who has served as the Queen's chaplain. We are hoping to speak to her in just a moment. We know that the Queen's faith was very important to her, and she also obviously was the head of the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and that was a role that was very important to her. But Robert Lacey is here with us, biographer of the Queen. Your thoughts, Robert? We knew at some stage, obviously, this news would come, but it is still a lot for people to absorb.
It is. It's very emotional. I mean, when you mentioned her faith, it'll be very interesting to hear from Bishop Rose, because she was one of the Queen's chaplains. The Queen had many chaplains, but I think one of the crucial things about Her Majesty, the Queen, was her deep religious faith. I mean, as a royal biographer, slightly galling, the only book which she ever approved and for which she wrote a foreword was called The Servant Queen and the King She Serves, and it was published by the Bible Society. And she was a woman who knelt on her knees every night to say her prayers. In the 1950s, when the American evangelist Dr. Billy Graham came to Britain, the Queen, just at the beginning of her reign, he wasn't a dreadfully fashionable figure with the Church of England. The Queen would invite Billy Graham to Windsor or Sandringham, wherever she was, to preach a sermon, and then invite him to lunch afterwards. And there's a wonderful story that he tells. It's so difficult to tell stories about the Queen because it's only rather indiscreet people who've met with her who tell us these things. And in this case, Dr. Graham, in his memoir, said they were discussing the sermon, and she was saying how much she liked it. And he said, well, you know, I nearly chose that story about when Jesus spoke to the sick man and said, rise. And apparently her eyes sparkled. And she said, that's my favorite Bible story. And went on to discuss it with him. And even a non-religious person, I think, can appreciate how this religious sense gave her a sense of perspective. Through all the scandals and troubles that afflicted her, she knew that time was the great healer, and she had faith that her God, the monarch she served, would provide.
Well, Bishop Rose Hudson-Wilkin is on the line now. Bishop Rose, you are there?
Hello.
Thank you for being with us, and you are one of those people who had conversations with the Queen. How will you remember her?
I will remember her as the mother of our nation, the person who was always there, the person who was not afraid to speak about faith matters in the right context, in particular in her Christmas broadcast that she would make, and someone who had an inner strength and courage and dependence on God that saw her through the years.
And so when you discuss these matters with her, you, as Robert Lacey was describing, you found her knowledgeable and interested and willing and able to discuss matters of faith and scripture.
Do you know, what I would say is that she held the title as head, the supreme head or governor of the church. This was not just a title. This was a person who had a faith, who lived a faith. So it was meaningful. And when something is meaningful, it actually impacts on one's life. And that was my experience of her.
Mm. And what did that mean for your interactions with her as her chaplain?
I think, like anyone else in the religious sphere, it means that, I was personally comfortable and at ease, and that is important, at ease, because what you were saying either in an address or in a conversation was not something that was alien to her.
Yes, that makes sense. So your world and her world, there was a true fit between them.
There was a commonality, yes.
Mm. Bishop Rose, thank you very much for talking to us on this day.
Should I say messages coming from all over the world. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House in the US, President Zelensky, the President of Ecuador, the King of Jordan. Many, many messages. Also, of course, words at home. Keir Starmer, opposition leader. So as our great Elizabethan era comes to an end, he says, we will honour the late Queen's memory by keeping alive the values of public service she embodied. Robert Lacey, historian and royal biographer, still with us. And Robert, whatever anybody thinks of the institution of monarchy, everybody who's been alive for a while feels they know the Queen almost personally, because she is such a fixture of national life. Imagine all the people who've been somewhere and seen the Queen at the Derby or Ascot or somewhere, for whom that is a memorable thing in their life, Robert. It is just extraordinary.
Well, one of her great skills, attributes, was the ability to somehow embody majesty and glory, but yet have such modesty. I mean, the most recent thing that struck me was when I was covering on Tuesday the transfer of power between prime ministers. I spoke to the people around her who said that a week ago she wanted to come down to London. And she didn't want to cause these important people, the old and the retiring and the new Prime Minister, the trouble of flying up to Scotland. And you'll see it on the record. The plan was that she would come down here. I suspect, actually, those important people rather like the glory of flying up to Scotland being seen, but that's another matter. And it was only regretfully that her doctor said, no, that just wasn't possible. The other thing, Bishop Rose there touched on the sense of history. Yes, we all feel we know her. She was born in the first decade of the House of Windsor. I mean, she's been an incredibly important component. The House of Windsor was only founded in 1917, when the name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was changed to Windsor by her grandfather, whom she called Grandpa England. She was born 1926, and she imbibed this sense of service from her grandfather and grandmother's knees.
I'm wondering whether many people in the country will feel we're a bit on our own now. We've been left on our own without the Queen there. Even though she didn't comment on big issues of national controversy, people will feel a little bit left on their own.
Yes, she had this gravitas, but, I mean, it sounds a condescending thing to say, the common touch. I mean, the fact she was renowned as a breeder and racer and owner of racehorses. Now, that's a very elite occupation in one way, but it's racehorsing is the second most popular sport in Britain, and she loved it and was adept at it.
Jim Nocty's still with us. You want to come in, Jim?
Back to the point that Robert made there about resisting the temptation to comment on this or that in the public sphere. It was precisely because she didn't do that she was able to absorb the kind of steadiness that she could impart, at moments of upheaval. It was because she never seemed to be kind of going one way or the other. Politically, never put a foot wrong. I mean, there was that awkward business of the Macmillan-Hume transition in 1963 when the Conservative Party didn't have an election process and she had to take Macmillan's advice about his successor. That could have been a sticky moment for the monarchy. Now, she got through it and I think was very grateful, one is told, that it never happened again. But politically, never put a foot wrong. And, of course, there were awkward moments, but they tended to happen around her, not because of anything she did. And she didn't respond in any trite way to anything, and that was an enormous strength. Because if you end up sort of commenting on everything, as a here today, gone tomorrow politician, you live to regret your own words. She never put herself in that position. And my goodness, what an act that is to follow.
Indeed. Actually, let's take a few moments to read some of the reaction from here in the UK, because we have some former prime ministers who have been making comments about the Queen's service and her role in their lives. Sir Tony Blair has said, "It is with profound sadness that I join the nation, the Commonwealth and the world in mourning the death of Her late Majesty the Queen. My prayers are with the King and the royal family. May God draw near them and comfort them in the days, weeks and months ahead." He said, "The Queen has been part of my life for all of my life. From the moment I waved my little flag as I watched her as a child be driven through the streets of Durham, to the honour of being her Prime Minister, to my last meeting with her and then lunching with her at Windsor Castle for the Garter ceremony just a few months ago, she has been an enduring presence of strength and stability."
These are the people, her prime ministers, and she had many of them. Liz Truss was her 15th. Winston Churchill was her first, but these are the people who saw her week after week, and we'll never know the content of those conversations, but they must have been fascinating. Here's another former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, who called her selfless and wise with a wonderful generosity of spirit. For 70 years, Her Majesty devoted her life to the service of our nation and its well-being. That is how she lived and how she led. For millions of people across the Commonwealth and the wider world, she embodied the heart and soul of our nation, admired and respected around the globe.
And in the last few minutes, Boris Johnson, who has just, of course, exited number 10, has said, "This is our country's saddest day. In the hearts of every one of us, there's an ache at the passing of our Queen."
There was a very interesting point made once by Jim Callaghan, Prime Minister from 76 to 79. I can't dig out the exact quote from the back of my mind, but he talked about the friendship that a Prime Minister felt in the Queen's presence at the weekly audience, helping them through difficult times. But it was a friendship that never became sort of pally and close. It wasn't that kind of friendship. It was a proper friendship. And you read all the Prime Ministerial recollections, as you have, Robert, about those meetings, and it's clear that they were, in their way, profound.
If ever, one of the Queen's lesser-known roles was to be a sort of personnel officer for the Prime Ministers.
Yeah.
I mean, the closest thing they had to a confidant or a psychiatrist was the Queen.
And Wilson used to say, if you hadn't read a cabinet paper, you got there and discovered that she knew it better than you did, you slunk out of the place as if you'd been in the headmaster's study and been given a dressing down,
Can I just interrupt? Clarence House has just confirmed Charles will be known as King Charles III. King Charles III, we heard Liz Truss refer him to that way. We were saying, we wouldn't have taken that for granted. Johnny, I don't know if you make anything of that.
No, I mean, I don't think it is a huge surprise. There are some royal names that are judged to be perhaps unfortunate or redolent of past failures. I think those days are probably over. I think it would have been hugely surprising if the new king had been known as anything apart from King Charles. We stood off discussing it like that until we had confirmation. The Prime Minister got there before us. No doubt that was agreed with the palace, and the palace has now confirmed it.
And sorry to break in, that's also something else that goes back to Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth II. Until her, there was this habit that may not be familiar to younger listeners of people called David calling themselves Edward VII, or people
her
called...
father wasn't George.
Exactly. And she just took the name... Elizabeth, of course, she is said to have said, and her son is following in that tradition.
Something else that we were not used to, now that we're with the king, as he now is, and of course now we know that he's going to be Charles III, but also Camilla, previously the Duchess of Cornwall, the Queen Consort, as she's referred to in the statement.
That's right. And this, of course, was a matter of some discussion, some would say controversy, over the past, 10 or 15 years. There was much discussion over how she would be known. And it was a relatively recent intervention, in fact, by the Queen to cement her place, the Queen Consort's place, in the constitutional pecking order, and to make sure that she would be known as the Queen Consort, and so she will. And so again, you have this continuity, certainly, but also, as I'm sure many in the audience will feel, a jarring sense of change.
It is going to be a sense of change. Coins, notes, stamps. I'm just seeing here from Press Association, coins featuring the new king will show him facing to the left. Elizabeth II faces to the right. That is a tradition dating back to the 17th century to alternate.
It changes each time.
The way successive monarchs are facing.
It is nearly 7:30 in the UK. We are broadcasting a BBC News special, bringing together all our UK networks and broadcasting around the world as well, with Evan Davis and Michelle Hussein, our coverage marking the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Let's get a summary of the news now with Chris Aldridge.
Buckingham Palace says the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. She was 96. She'd reigned for 70 years, longer than any other British monarch. Flags at Buckingham Palace and at Downing Street have been lowered to half-mast. Earlier today, all 4 of the Queen's children travelled to Balmoral. A statement from Charles, who's now the King, said the death of his beloved mother was a moment of the greatest sadness for him and all members of his family. He said he and his family would be comforted and sustained by the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held. Buckingham Palace said the King and the Queen Consort would remain at Balmoral this evening and return to London tomorrow. Speaking in Downing Street in the past half hour, the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, described the Queen as the rock on which modern Britain had been built. She said the crown had now passed to His Majesty King Charles III, and she ended her address, "God save the King."
Chris, thank you for that. The Queen was crowned at Westminster Abbey, 2nd of June 1953, nearly 18 months after she succeeded her father, King George VI. Her coronation was the first to be broadcast on television. It drew an audience of millions. It was at the time the biggest outside broadcast ever mounted. The BBC reported that 3 million people lined the streets of London to catch a glimpse of the new monarch as she made her way to and from Buckingham Palace in the Golden State Coach.
Her Majesty is already in her fairy tale golden coach, drawn up under the portico of the grand entrance, and any second now she will drive away from her home into the world waiting outside. And now the coach moves. The coach is leaving the Queen's home on the greatest day of her life. There is no sun out here at the moment, but the sun is concentrated in the glorious gold of that lovely coach, and in the Queen's smile, serenely happy, radiant, untroubled.
Well, on that day then, in the Abbey, in front of more than 8,000 guests, including prime ministers and heads of state from around the Commonwealth, she took the coronation oath.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and of your possessions and the other territories to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs?
I solemnly promise so to do.
After being handed those 4 symbols of authority, the orb, the sceptre, the rod of mercy, and the royal ring of sapphire and rubies, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Geoffrey Fisher, placed St. Edward's crown on her head to complete the ceremony.
God crown you with a crown of glory and righteousness, that having a right faith and manifold fruit of good works, you may obtain the crown of an everlasting kingdom by the gift of him whose kingdom endureth forever. Amen.
And the new Queen's first Prime Minister was Sir Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister at that time, and he attended the coronation and later that night broadcast to the nation and the Commonwealth.
Here at the summit of our worldwide community is a lady whom we respect because she is our Queen, and whom we love because she is herself. Gracious and noble are words familiar to us all in courtly phrasing. Tonight they have a new ring in them because we know they are true about the gleaming figure whom Providence has brought to us, and brought to us in times where the present is hard and the future veiled.
Well, there you have it from the coronation. Jim, it's interesting, isn't it? Actually, listening to the voices, the commentary voices, it was a very different era. The world has changed quite a bit. The country has changed quite a bit.
Well, you hear it in the voices, the commentary. Churchill's sonorous tones there, of course, magnificent, but from a distant age, from an age that's long gone. And if you listen to the voice that the Queen had in the 50s compared with the voice that, became known to us in her later years, it had changed considerably. And in that you can trace the changes in this country, the shift from an age of deference, of a very rigidly stratified society when she came to the throne, where the Debs were still presented at court until 1957, in which, Queen Mary, the widow of George V, was still there in Marlborough House through the coronation. She died soon afterwards, who was essentially a Victorian figure, a sort of German Victorian figure, if you know what I mean. And that was the influence that the Queen had grown up with, that and the abdication and the war, of course. But the change that she saw in the succeeding 10 or 15 years, and, Robert, as a biographer, has written about the trauma of this young woman having to tell her sister, Princess Margaret, that she could not marry the man she loved because divorce was unacceptable to the Church of England, of which the Queen was Supreme Governor. I mean, a traumatic personal event, but redolent of a wider social set of values and rules, which had passed away in the next 15 years. And the extraordinary thing about the Queen was that she seemed to be able to ride the tide. She was never left on the beach while the water went out. She carried on. And somehow she was behaving in the 90s like somebody who had taken all this on board and sort of managed it. And, if you'd said to someone in the 1950s that the monarch would take part in a sketch with James Bond at the Olympics, and indeed at the Platinum Jubilee with Paddington Bear and putting her hand in and taking out a marmalade sandwich from the handbag with perfect comic timing, people would have said, well, she just doesn't do that kind of thing. But she knew how far to go and how far not to go. And that business, which Johnny's chronicled so often, and of course Robert has written about how far you open up the mystical world without destroying it, is of course a very delicate one. And when the film Royal Family was made, with the Duke of Edinburgh very much in favour in the late 60s, you saw them, I mean, it's so innocent looking back on it, the picnic on a tartan rug at Balmoral, for goodness sake. It's hardly intrusive. But it was something that hadn't been done. The veil was lifted, and the question is, how far could it go? And when you got some of them playing around on It's a Knockout, I thought, that's going a little far. But the Queen never put a foot wrong. And that, I think, is why, for people who wouldn't call themselves, in that rather strange word, monarchists, but who nonetheless, not in some soupy, glutinous way, deeply admired the example she represented and set. And the reason why she could reach so many parts of society, that she had an instinctive sense of what you could do and what you couldn't do. And goodness me, the politicians who've seen her and watched her all realise, I wish we could learn something from that.
Jim, thank you. Well, from what I can see from the live pictures we're seeing from outside Buckingham Palace, it looks like people have really flocked there in the last hour or so. Paddy O'Connell is there outside the palace now. Paddy, of course, she died at Balmoral, but this was her London home. What can you see around you?
Well, really, it's the smell of flowers, Michelle, as you join me. I'm standing at the gates themselves. People are coming past me, gently squeezing floral tributes through the iron bars, managing in many ways you can hear them dropping, in fact, as they manage to secure them in there. I've just bumped into Lord Lloyd Webber. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. There's a big crowd of us here. He, of course, told me that he was here for the pageant, the Jubilee pageant, just months ago. He's visibly shocked. He has spoken to us in a recording we'll bring you later. He said he just felt the thing to do was to come to Buckingham Palace because she had been a presence in his entire lifetime, and he just wanted to come and lay his own tribute. And then he's a lord, and he finds himself brushing shoulders here with the rest of us, people from far and wide. A lady from Bath just spoken to me. She came up, got the train straight away. She wanted to come to Buckingham Palace. And so for many people here I'm speaking to, it's of course the sense of constancy, but it's the sense of clarity. It seems to be a UK that's easier to understand in the rearview mirror. And this sense of a crossroads is coming out from time and time again from people. Where next? Who next? What next? And it's very moving to hear people put that into their own words. And actually, it seems to be just coming here if we are at a crossroads, this is a crossroads itself, isn't it? I've just cycled through London. I came through Theatreland. I cycled down Pall Mall, home of the famous clubs. And I thought to myself, oh, London's going on. They're all going to the theatre. There's all those people going into what we used to call the gentlemen's clubs. And then, as I reached the Mall, cycling up it, a river of people headed towards the palace, and I realised I was wrong, that the people want to be here, Michelle, perhaps just because they don't know where else to be.
It's very moving to see the pictures of exactly what you're describing, and it's something instinctive, it's something visceral, it is something emotional that is drawing people to the palace gates this way.
Yes. And of course, for those of us who remember the death of Diana, this was the centre of the questions about the Queen's legacy, because of course she sat just above me in the balcony window, the window of the palace rooms, looking down at the Mall, and it's impossible to escape all the other moments of history, the recent Jubilee, and I stood here among the crowds laying tributes to Prince Philip, and I remember the messages on those cards that people wrote was thank you to him for being constant with her. So of course you can see that people wanted her to be supported. They felt that he was a lifelong consort, and this is the people I met. I'm not trying to speak for people I haven't met. I came here with the crowds, and that's what they wanted to say. The main message then was thank you. And then of course they all think of the Queen on her own after he died, and so inevitably people are supporting her, are they not, by coming here?
Yes, it really does feel that way. Paddy, thank you very much. Paddy O'Connell there outside Buckingham Palace. And you know, earlier, Evan, do you remember there was that? It was very, very wet, and then it was like the sky brightened and a rainbow came out. Just very dramatic.
Just to remind you, you're listening to a BBC News special, all BBC networks coming together as we report on and reflect on the death of Her Majesty the Queen. Now, someone who has commentated on many royal events through the decades is David Dimbleby, and he joins us now. And David, this is a very big moment, isn't it, for the nation?
I think it is, as your people have been saying, a turning point, a kind of the curtain falling on 70 years. I mean, I was at the coronation. I remember walking through the streets of London when my father went to do the commentary in Westminster Abbey and watching her from a window as she went past. And as you say, commented on a number of state occasions, the big events, the Jubilees, the state opening of Parliament and all that time that those went on. And I think my feeling today, of course, we knew the day had to come. But looking back is that every country has to have a head of state. And the Queen really was an impeccable head of state. We didn't know her views. We knew she was intensely interested in everything that went on in the country. She was always, you look through the court circular, every day, day after day, meeting different people. And before any of those meetings having to be briefed on who they were, what they did, whether it was science or education or children or hospitals, that constant work, I think, was just astonishing. And at the same time, with that humility, you remember in the Annus Cerebrallis when she said, no institution, and she mentioned monarchy, should be free from scrutiny, as long as it's done with gentleness, good humour and understanding. I think she had set a wonderful example. But I remember one thing actually today too, thinking back, is of an act of kindness that she did. When my father was dying in hospital, out of the blue, an equerry arrived outside his hospital ward and came in with 6 bottles of champagne for him, sent by the Queen with her good wishes. So I have a kind of feeling that, and I didn't know her, I stood in line twice, I think, and just bowed and said, good morning, Your Majesty,
David,
or something.
That's a
I never
lovely
knew her,
story.
but I thought
That's
that
a
sort
lovely
of touch,
story.
which other people have experienced, was just the human side of somebody who actually, in public, had all the time to be on guard and performing and doing her duty. It's an extraordinary 70 years.
It is indeed. And you say there, you didn't get to know her very well. She didn't come and tell you what to say about her or anything like that.
No. I had no contact at all. I met her when New Broadcasting House opened, and there was a lineup of sort of old hacks, John Humphreys, me, I can't remember who else, and we just. I think I was very daring. I said to Your Majesty, I've just finished a film about your coronation, which is going out tonight. I hope you might be able to watch it. And she just said, how interesting. We thought actually she'd go home and have better things to do.
Well, I remember, David, as Jim here, on that occasion when she came in, I was sitting in the studio, next door studio to the one we're in now, when she came in to speak and open New Broadcasting House, and Tony Hall, then Director General, had to introduce her. And beforehand, we had this slightly awkward chit-chat, and I said something banal about welcome to New Broadcasting House, and she said, yes, I remember being here with my sister in 1941 or something, which I felt put me rather nicely in my place, David, yes. but of course, in an extremely charming way, and talked about remembering watching Children's Hour or whatever it had been, you know.
I think the list of changes that she lived through, you were talking about political changes and the way prime ministers were appointed, but you think of the collapse of empire, you know, the invention of the Commonwealth. You think about what was going on in Northern Ireland. You think about her actually shaking hands with McGuinness, you know, when the IRA had murdered her uncle. You think about her behaviour at Diana's death when, you know, they came back to London and she made that wonderful address with the crowds outside from Buckingham Palace. I mean, inscrutable in some ways, but at the same time, so human that I think people identified always with her. However, they felt the institution is, you know, separate and apart, and you don't get to know much about it. But nevertheless, a kind of feeling that they understood her, that she was always reacting to everything. You know, the number of occasions when you saw her in little bits of film or things, laughing or talking to some people, talking to children in a hospital, those sort of things, just magical.
David, the coverage, we were commenting earlier on the voices at the time of the coronation, and the coverage changed over the decades, didn't it, reflecting the changes in the society over which she reigned?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think there was, I mean, certainly in the very early days after she came to the throne, there was a much more coverage of events around the royal family. I mean, I remember things like, you know, the Queen Mother opening a display of needlework, for instance, at Clarence House. That was worth a broadcast. We always broadcast the Maundy money. The Garter service, for instance, was often televised because the BBC, I think, was exploring, you know, how to cover these things, and that did decline. But I mean, the state opening and the jubilees have always been sort of fully covered and haven't changed. I mean, that's what's extraordinary. The state opening is exactly as it's always been.
David, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, we heard earlier from Downing Street from Liz Truss, and we've had statements from the Queen's former Prime Ministers, and we're joined on the line now by one of them, by Theresa May. Mrs May, thank you for being with us on this momentous day. What are your memories of the Queen?
Well, this is obviously a desperately sad day for the country, but also for the Commonwealth and for people around the world, because Queen Elizabeth II was respected around the world. And her devotion to duty, she gave a lifetime of service. This was an inspiration to us all. But of course, we mustn't forget, while we're thinking of our own memories of her, that she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother. And my thoughts and prayers are with the royal family. And of course, as a Prime Minister, I had the huge honour of being able to have audiences, regular audiences with the Queen, but also to enjoy time at Balmoral, where she was a great hostess. She wanted to put people at their ease, for them to relax. She had that great sense of not just duty, but actually a recognition that of the importance of people, of individuals.
And your audiences with her, what were they like?
Well, they're a conversation. Of course, we never say what took place in those, what was said in those audiences, but it is a conversation. But significantly, it was a conversation with somebody who was immensely knowledgeable and understanding of the issues. Many people don't realise how much work the Queen put into her red boxes, to understanding the issues of the day, what was going on in the government and around the rest of the world. And quite simply, of all the leaders, of all the heads of state that I met, Queen Elizabeth II was the most impressive.
Because you must have sat there in those audiences knowing that here is someone who's seen, all of my recent and indeed not so recent predecessors doing exactly this job.
Well, indeed. I was number 13. Of course, we now have, she had an audience with the 15th Prime Minister of her reign, only, a couple of days ago. It is incredible when you sat and spoke with the Queen, because she knew many of the world leaders that one was meeting as Prime Minister. She'd seen many issues. There are issues in politics that come and go. And her immense experience, but as I say, her immense understanding was, hugely important in those conversations. But also, she had a great sense of humour as well.
Really? And can you, I don't know if you can share a Queen joke?
I'm not sure it would be appropriate, well, on this day of all days, I don't think that would be quite fitting.
I understand that, but we are remembering her with appreciation and with gratitude as well as sorrow on this day. It's very interesting to hear you talk about the conversation. So it's not, the tone of these meetings is not you briefing her. She would comment, would she, and she would offer counsel?
Well, I think you're trying to tempt me down a route of talking about
not in the content. I absolutely respect that. It's just to understand.
Yes. It is more of a conversation. And as I say, it's because she had such immense experience in the sense of the number of issues that she'd seen, the number of prime ministers she'd dealt with, the number of world leaders that she dealt with. And I saw the impact that she had on people when we hosted CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2018. And I remember we were meeting at Windsor Castle. There was a reception before the lunch. I and one or two others, but none of the other leaders knew that Her Majesty would come to the reception. And the minute she walked into the room, there was that everybody turned their heads. People wanted to speak to her. There was huge respect for her across the Commonwealth, as there has been across the whole world.
And she also demonstrated tremendous stamina, didn't she? I mean, she lived to 96. She'd reduced the number of engagements and she didn't travel anymore. But you could see, not least in seeing the outgoing and the incoming Prime Minister 2 days ago, but other occasions as well, that she made that effort. And it must have been a great physical effort for her at this stage of her life.
Well, indeed, when you think about many of the events that she would have been going to, standing for a long time, having to meet a whole different raft of people, but she was interested in people. I think one of the last, if not the last, public event in public that she did was opening Thames Hospice in my constituency in July. And when she did that, you saw the interest, the compassion, the way in which she spoke to staff and a patient. It just came across her intense interest in people and her wishing to put people at their ease.
And you were saying about you've been to stay with her in Balmoral. Was it a more relaxed and off-duty Queen, if you like, that you saw there?
Yes, indeed. It was a more relaxed environment. But the Queen did very much want her guests to feel relaxed too and to enjoy their time at Balmoral. And at Balmoral, I think I was able to see her intense love of the countryside. And she enjoyed being at Balmoral, but she took a great interest in the estate, in the animals on the estate, in the how the estate was going. A great love of the countryside came through.
Mm. And you would have seen her with Prince Philip as well in his lifetime.
Indeed, I did. And of course, for the times that I was at Balmoral, both the Queen and Prince Philip were there. So I saw them together, an amazing relationship, which, as we know, lasted for so many decades.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mrs. May. Thank you for being with us. Former Prime Minister Theresa May.
Theresa May there. Lots of reaction from around the world. Let me just mention a couple. President Macron of France said Queen Elizabeth embodied the British nation's continuity and unity over 70 years. Remembered her as a friend of France and a kind-hearted queen. And the Irish President, Michael D. Higgins, called the Queen a remarkable friend of Ireland, said her visit in 2011 marked a crucial step in the normalisation of relations with nearest neighbours. We all, of course, remember that. Also, Duke of Cambridge, Duke and Duchess of Cambridge are now being referred to on their social media accounts as the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and Cambridge. Just one of the many things, Johnny Diamond still with us, the choreography of what goes on now as we pass through the end of that reign of Elizabeth II.
Evan, there is a cascade of change now that will unfold over the hours and days and weeks to come. We are still, of course, remembering the passing of the monarch. And in amongst these tributes, one has stood out to me. It's from the Royal British Legion, which of course works so hard for military veterans. She was the patron. The Queen was the patron of the Legion. It expresses her thanks for her faithful service. And we join, it says, the entire armed forces community in mourning the loss of its commander-in-chief. A reminder that the Queen had so many roles, but a critical one, and one perhaps that gets forgotten in a slightly less military nation than the one that she took over as the head of state of her role as commander-in-chief. On the 75th anniversary of VE Day, she gave an address, and on the desk in front of her there was a cap, and it was her cap, 2nd Subaltern Windsor, when she was in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She treasured not just the cap itself, but the memory of her time in service, and her devotion to the armed forces was noted by so many, and by politicians who might try and close a regiment or a headquarters here. There would be a gentle word said in those weekly audiences with the Prime Minister, and suddenly that closure would just disappear. It was hugely important to her, and her support was hugely important to the armed forces as well. There will be great mourning across the armed forces today.
These armed forces, one very important institution. Of course, charities will also be mourning the loss of Elizabeth II as well. She was a great supporter of many charities, patron to many as well.
And that those patronages, even if they didn't mean that she would always be there physically, they meant that they could rely upon support in some shape or form, and that meant so much in so many ways. And it meant a lot in simple fundraising, but it also meant a lot for moral support, for that kind of unspoken, unsung of work that so many people did. It's that kind of below the radar, that iceberg. We saw the pomp and ceremony, we saw the great events, but you would not see so much of went on beneath the surface that was so important to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people over the decades.
Johnny, thanks for that. And this is a BBC News special. We are reporting on the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The wrought iron gates at Buckingham Palace have been brightened by dozens of colourful bouquets. They've been laid by mourners. We heard from Paddy O'Connell there. Notes left. One reads, "We had you for longer than we deserved you." Hundreds of people streamed down the pavements, winding through nearby Green Park on their way to pay tribute at the royal residence. Now, this is a BBC News special with Michelle Hussein and Evan Davis, marking the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We'll continue to remember her life and hear from those who've observed close up her long reign. But as we approach 8 o'clock, here's Chris Aldridge with a summary.
This is BBC News with a special programme across all our UK networks and around the world, marking the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Michelle Hussein and Evan Davis here in the studio, and we will be spending time gathering memories of the Queen's life. She has died at the age of 96 and after 70 years on the throne. She died at one of her homes, Balmoral, in Scotland. Here is Chris Aldridge with what we've heard in the last few minutes.
Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has died. She was 96. She'd reigned for 70 years, making her the longest-serving monarch in British history. In a statement issued just after 6:30 this evening, Buckingham Palace said the Queen died peacefully this afternoon at Balmoral, where she'd been staying since July. Earlier, all 4 of her children had travelled to Balmoral, as well as Prince William. Clarence House confirmed that the new king, the Queen's eldest son, would be known as King Charles III. In a statement, he said the death of his beloved mother was a moment of the greatest sadness for all the members of his family. He acknowledged her loss would be deeply felt by countless people around the world and said that during this period of mourning and change, he and his family would be comforted and sustained by their knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held. Speaking in the past hour in Downing Street, the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, paid tribute to the Queen.
Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation.
Liz Truss ended her address, God Save the King. Buckingham Palace said the new King and Queen Consort would remain at Balmoral this evening before returning to London tomorrow. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell says many people will share the pain of the royal family.
It is a huge loss, and I think many people will find it disorientating, the feeling that this person who has been such a constant presence in the background of their lives, that this person is no longer there. It is hard, really, to take it in, to speak of her in the past tense, to fully appreciate that this reign, this longest reign in British history, is finally over.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said the Queen's life had been one of extraordinary dedication and service. The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davies, said the Queen had served our country faithfully all her life and was loved the world over. The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson said this was our country's saddest day, and in the hearts of every one of us there was an ache at her passing. His predecessor, Theresa May, said it had been the honour of her life to serve the Queen as Prime Minister.
She was a great hostess. She wanted to put people at their ease, for them to relax. She had that great sense of not just duty, but actually a recognition of the importance of people, of individuals.
Sir John Major said she had been an example of duty and leadership for so very many years. His successor as Prime Minister, Sir Tony Blair, said the UK had lost not just its monarch, but the matriarch of the nation, who more than any other brought the country together. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said the Queen's steadfast loyalty, service and humility had helped us make sense of who we are through decades of extraordinary change. The leader of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, called her a shining light in our history. World leaders, too, have spoken warmly of the Queen. President Biden said she was more than a monarch and had defined an era. President Macron said she'd been a friend of France. The lights of the Eiffel Tower will be turned off tonight as a tribute. This evening, crowds of people are gathering outside Buckingham Palace. Our home editor, Mark Easton, is there.
This is a crowd of every generation and every background. There are a lot of young people, a lot of people from ethnic minorities. It's a very mixed crowd, and she was a queen that was able to be a figurehead for people from whatever background in Britain. We've got tens of thousands of people here already. I think this is going to become the focal point for national grief over the next few days. This is a huge moment for the country.
Mark Easton at Buckingham Palace.
And it's 8:05 now. Thank you, Chris, for the news summary. You're listening to a BBC News special with me, Evan Davis, and with Michelle Hussein. Now, among the many tributes being paid to Her Majesty, many, of course, coming in from politicians, the Prime Minister Liz Truss, Prime Minister just for a couple of days, was, of course, with the Queen at the point she became Prime Minister, and had this to say from the steps of Downing Street.
Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. Her life of service stretched beyond most of our living memories. In return, she was loved and admired by the people in the United Kingdom and all around the world. She has been a personal inspiration to me and to many Britons. Her devotion to duty is an example to us all. Earlier this week, at 96, she remained determined to carry out her duties as she appointed me as her 15th Prime Minister. Throughout her life, she's visited more than 100 countries, and she has touched the lives of millions around the world.
Some of the words there of Liz Truss at the lectern in Downing Street. Now, the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, has also reflected on her life.
Today we mourn the passing of a remarkable sovereign. It is a deep private loss for the royal family, and our first thoughts are with them at this time. The nation shares in their grief. Queen Elizabeth II created a special, personal relationship with us all, a relationship based on service and devotion to her country. Nobody under the age of 70 has known anything other than Queen Elizabeth II on the throne. For the vast majority of us, the late Queen has been simply the Queen, the only Queen. Above all else, our Queen. As we mourn her loss, we should also treasure her life, our longest serving and greatest ever monarch. Above the clashes of politics, she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what it agreed upon. In crisis, she reassured us, reminding us that we are all part of something that stretches back through time, a symbol of the best of us. I saw it for myself when I led the Crown Prosecution Service. Every time I had the privilege to meet the late Queen, she would ask the most searching questions because she wanted to understand the lives and struggles of her people. And as Britain changed rapidly around her, this dedication became the still point of our turning world, an example that taught us that whatever the challenges we face, the values of service always endures. And the obvious love the late Queen displayed for Britain, the British people gave back in return. That is why there is such an outpouring of grief across the nation today, as there is across the Commonwealth, to which the late Queen was so devoted. Around the world, people are united in mourning and united in celebrating her life. This togetherness is a reminder of what she achieved, a reminder of our shared values, values which I know will be upheld by her beloved son Charles, our new king. So as our great Elizabethan era comes to an end, we will honour the late Queen's memory by keeping alive the values of public service she embodied. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II stood as the head of our country, but in spirit, she stood amongst us.
The words of Sir Keir Starmer there, reflecting on the life of Queen Elizabeth. Let's join our political editor, Chris Mason. He's on the line. And Chris, politics is going to stop at this point.
It is, Evan, and it is for that very profound reason you heard reflected on in the extracts that we've just heard there, the weight and gravity of those words chosen by our political leaders, reflecting this profound moment in our history. A new Prime Minister, just 48 hours in office, the 15th of the Queen's reign, tasked with finding the right words at such a moment, just 2 days on from that first and final audience that Liz Truss was to have with Her Majesty. That moment, one of many that many Prime Ministers enjoy, that so many reflect after they've served in office, is so central to the British system of government. David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, issuing a statement in the last half an hour or so, saying it was each week a privilege to have the almost unique ability to sit down in private with Queen Elizabeth and to be able to call on the sage advice and wise counsel that she could offer. He reflects that it was a huge advantage, it is a huge advantage of the British system, that Prime Ministers have this special access. He says he was fortunate to be able to call on the knowledge of the world's greatest public servant and the world's most experienced diplomat. So yes, politics will pause, Evan, and what was very striking at lunchtime, and it personified in many ways the difference between Parliament and government and that other branch of the British Constitution, the monarch and the royal family, that it should be in that moment of such intense political debate, the very reason that the House of Commons exists as our cockpit of democracy, that argument going on about energy bills and the government, that the support the government is going to provide, that it was at that moment that notes were sent in by a government minister to the Prime Minister and to the Leader of the Opposition, bringing them the news of the Queen's declining health at lunchtime. So yes, politics will pause. There'll be quiet reflections here at Westminster, as there will around the UK and in many corners of the world, and we won't see for some time the return of the noise and anger of conventional political debate. Such is the gravity of this moment, as plenty of people will no doubt reflect on how the UK sees itself with the passing of the Elizabethan era and how the world sees the UK.
Chris Mason, thank you for that.
Well, it's a loss for the nation, but it's also a profound personal loss for a family. She was a mother, grandmother and great-grandmother, and many of those immediate family members are at Balmoral, where she died this afternoon. Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent, is here. We have had this emotional statement from her son, the new king, Charles, but we did. This was a day where we saw them travel to be there before this news was made public.
A day that no one really imagined, and yet it was those journeys, the news that her children were making their way, clearly at some speed, with some urgency, to Balmoral, that really brought home the seriousness of the situation. And of course, a reminder that for all the castles and the fine robes and the ceremony that accompanies the royal family, it is a family. And we look at the statement of King Charles, of the Queen's son, and the first phrase, of course, is the death of my beloved mother. This is both a moment of state, a great moment of state and of nation, but it is also an intensely personal moment, yes, for that relatively small group that makes up the royal family, but also for the wider family within the UK and around the world, in the realms and in the Commonwealth, who all saw the Queen as, in some way, a relative, a friend, an acquaintance, a symbol of continuity, all these things. So it's all these different roles that she played in so many different lives come together at this moment of her passing, and are reflected now and will be reflected in the days to come.
Night has fallen over London, but you can see that outside Buckingham Palace, people are continuing to go to lay flowers, or in some cases just to be there. It's like there's a pull.
Back in the mid-40s, there was a diplomat and diarist, a man called Harold Nicholson, who observed the crowds surging towards Buckingham Palace on rumours of the death of King George VI, the Queen's father. And he said, what a strange thing is monarchy. And we should acknowledge now it is a strange thing, almost an irrational thing in lots of ways, and that is what makes it so fascinating and draws so many of us to it.
Being irrational.
Indeed,
Robert Lacey.
That's what's so wonderful, and we heard about her role in the Commonwealth. The reason why the Commonwealth is, let's boast a bit about it, is the most successful post-imperial creation in the world is because of the human touch that the Queen brought to it. The French lost their empire. They tried to keep going with the idea of Frenchness. The Spanish had a huge empire. The only country in the world, and I'll be shouted down for being a chauvinist on this, that whose empire created something successful and new is the Commonwealth. As you said earlier, Michelle, gone 57 countries, more than a quarter of the United Nations. And most of those came to independence in the Queen's reign, and it was the Queen who embodied Britishness in some way, and all these feelings we're talking about now are, of course, being felt all round. People talk about the Commonwealth being important for soft power, but it's emotion, it's the heart of the matter.
Well, she made it the family of nations, didn't she? That was how she saw it. That's the tone she set.
Yes, just a little technical point, interestingly, her tutor when she was a young man, Professor Martin, was in fact one of the devisers of the idea of the Commonwealth, and turning the empire into something better and more fruitful. And I think historians, when they look at her reign, will pick on that, the way Britain's been able to continue to punch far above its weight, thanks to what she represented through the Commonwealth.
Robert, also, look, that's one institution, the Commonwealth. The monarchy, she couldn't have signalled more clearly in the last few years, particularly about through the last 3 years, how it's not about her and all her children, it's about the direct line of succession. We saw that again and again, not least over the Platinum Jubilee.
Yes, and earlier this year, we were getting ready for her the commemoration of her accession, and how we knew that she would always hark back to how sad she was at the news that her father had died. And what did she do, the Queen, when she spoke about it? She chose this opportunity to use all her prestige to place her blessing, as it were, on the new Queen consort, on Camilla. And we talked about it earlier, but suddenly Camilla, as Queen, only this year, in a way, became credible, and the Queen, looking back to the past, was thinking about the future in this human way.
Only a few months ago. Robert Lacey, thank you.
Well, let's pause now and think about the way Queen Elizabeth II carried out her duties, the honour, the dignity, which was rewarded with respect and admiration. Our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, looks back at the Queen's life.
She wasn't born to be Queen, yet she became Britain's longest-lived and longest-reigning monarch. Across the decades, as society changed fundamentally, Elizabeth II was a constant and, for many, a reassuring symbol of national unity. It was a life, above all, which was guided by her sense of duty, something she'd first referred to in a broadcast at the age of 21.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Born in April 1926, Princess Elizabeth's role as a royal was transformed 10 years later when her father came to the throne after her uncle had abdicated.
The early years of George VI's reign were dominated by the Second World War, much of which Elizabeth spent within the comparative safety of Windsor Castle. At the start of the conflict, Elizabeth had fallen in love with Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, a prince of Greece, though he was largely Danish, and an officer in the Royal Navy. They married 8 years later.
And as the wedding march peals out gaily through the Abbey.
The early years of their married life were relaxed, but in February 1952, Elizabeth's father died while she was in Kenya. Her coronation the following year was watched by millions. The Queen enjoyed being a constitutional monarch. She had the right to be consulted, to advise and to warn. She never gave an interview, but in the early 1990s she spoke in a BBC documentary about her duties and the nature of her life.
If you live in this sort of life, which people don't very much, you live very much by tradition and by continuity. I find that's one of the sad things, that people don't take on jobs for life. They try different things all the time. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you'll know exactly what you're going to be doing 2 months hence, or even beginning to know about next year. And I think that this is what the younger members find difficult, is the regimented side of it.
By 1992, there'd been fairy tale royal weddings and painful separations. At the end of that year, there was a fire at Windsor Castle. The Queen admitted it had been a difficult 12 months.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
When Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in Paris in 1997, the monarchy was shaken. The Queen was accused of being out of touch. She made a live television broadcast on the eve of Diana's funeral.
I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory.
5 years after Diana's death, in 2002, people turned out in their tens of thousands to mark the Queen's Golden Jubilee. One of the highlights was a pop concert inside Buckingham Palace. There were more significant milestones, a historic state visit to the Republic of Ireland and an equally historic first handshake with the then Northern Ireland's Deputy First Minister, Martin McGuinness, once a former commander of the IRA. In June 2012, a national service of thanksgiving was held at St Paul's Cathedral to mark the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. A month later, at the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, she played herself in a spoof James Bond film. She was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother who became Britain's longest-serving monarch in September 2015 when she surpassed the reign of Victoria. It wasn't something the Queen said that she'd ever aspired to.
Inevitably, a long life can pass by many milestones. My own is no exception. But I thank you all, and the many others at home and overseas, for your touching messages of great kindness.
She continued with her public duties well into her 90s, often alone after the retirement of the Duke of Edinburgh. There was further family turmoil. Prince Andrew was forced to withdraw from public life over his ill-judged friendship with a convicted American sex offender. And then the Sussexes, Harry and Meghan, decided that they wanted to step back from royal life. They were unsettling moments, presided over by a monarch who showed that her sense of commitment was undiminished. It was evident again during the coronavirus epidemic. The Queen, in isolation at Windsor for her own protection from the virus, broadcast a reassuring message to the nation.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Her personal resilience was tested in the spring of 2021 when her beloved husband Philip died 2 months short of his 100th birthday. At his funeral within Windsor Castle, curtailed by the social distancing requirements of the pandemic, the Queen seemed a solitary figure. But despite the great sadness of the loss of her husband of 73 years, there was never any question of her withdrawing. Public duties were resumed, public respect for a long-lived monarch deepened. She marked the 70th anniversary of her accession to the throne, a record no other monarch had achieved, in February 2022. By then it was apparent that she was rather more frail physically than before. Her doctors had advised her to take things a little easier. Light duties was the expression used by the palace. In a message to mark her 70 years on the throne, she said she was grateful for and humbled by the loyalty and affection she'd received throughout her reign. And she signed the statement, "Your servant, Elizabeth R." By June 2022 and the public celebration of her Platinum Jubilee, her declining health limited the events she could attend. There was, however, a delightful surprise. A pre-recorded appearance, a somewhat chaotic tea party with Paddington Bear.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Happy Jubilee, ma'am. And thank you for everything.
That's very kind.
This was a monarch at peace and enjoying herself. On the final day of the Jubilee celebrations, there was a final appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The national anthem was sung. A much-loved monarch acknowledged the many thousands who'd waited to greet her. The crowds cheered and cheered, but finally it was time to go. The Queen turned to depart from the balcony on which she'd first been seen as a baby. There was an unspoken feeling that an era was drawing to a close. For decade after decade, Elizabeth II embodied the strengths of a constitutional monarch, a steadfast presence in a constantly shifting world, representing a changing kingdom to itself and to the wider world. Hers was a life guided by Christian faith and by the unfaltering sense of duty to which she'd pledged herself on her 21st birthday. It was something she'd reflected on during her Silver Jubilee in 1977.
When I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Well, some highlights there of a royal life. Nicholas Witchell put that together for us. Just to say, all national BBC radio stations have been brought together for this special programme reflecting the life of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, whose death was announced by Buckingham Palace just after 6:30 this evening.
With us now is Giles Brandreth, writer, broadcaster, former MP and a long-standing friend of the Duke of Edinburgh. Giles, as such, you spent time with the Queen and the Duke. What was she like?
Oh my, this isn't it, the end of an era. There's such sadness for us as a country and for her family in particular. An extraordinary life, really, as we know. 70 years, I think, 7 months and 3 days she was the Queen, but she was brought up royal, and yet there's something about her. Why is this such a momentous moment? Because of the 70 years, but also because I think there was something unique and special about her, you know, driven by duty, as we know, sustained by faith, made happy by her dogs and her horses, but there was something in her personality that was very special. She was generous, she was enjoyable to be with. She was easy to be with. No one is totally normal with the Queen. There's an invisible moat around the Queen. But there was about her a kindness, a courtesy, a consideration. And the one thing that I felt very blessed to have been able to see at first hand over many years was her sense of humour. It's the one thing we didn't really get much of in public, because she was quite circumspect in public. But in private, she had a very lively sense of humour, and often quite a wry sense of humour. She could say things and raise an eyebrow and give you the impression of what she really felt and meant. Not that she ever said, in my hearing, anything that was cruel or unkind. She was a wholly positive person who lived a wholly good life. It's quite extraordinary. Not only to be the longest reigning sovereign, but I would have thought probably the most popular and certainly the most respected, just in this country, throughout the Commonwealth, and around the world. A unique human being.
And it's not as if, Giles, she wasn't tested at times. And just in Nicholas Witchell's report, looking back on her reign, the moments that she would have remembered with relish and moments which were difficult, for example, 1992.
She was always true to herself. She was herself. And she was accustomed to this kind of drama. The soap opera elements, as the Duke of Edinburgh sometimes called them. Both of them were the great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. They were used to the ups and downs of monarchy. She only came to the throne when she did because her uncle had been involved in the scandal of marrying an American divorcee. When she was a young queen, there was the scandal of her sister's possible relationship with Group Captain Townsend, who had been her father's equerry. Who was she going to marry? So the things that we now think of as new and sort of worrying actually were things that she had been accustomed to. She'd weathered. She said, I think, at the coronation of her parents, she said that she got into the carriage and it was quite rattly at first, but we got used to it quite quickly. And that's how she felt, I think, about her reign. Oh, quite rattly at first, but you do get used to it. She weathered all those storms.
Hearing you say that explains a lot because, as an outsider, one can look at some of the, the divorces, the issues with the press, the recent, family ups and downs as well.
And of course, it did sometimes get to her. I
but
remember
she could take it in her stride.
At Guildhall, she was there on that day. Remember, she gave that speech. Nicholas Witchell gave
the Annus Horribilis speech.
The Annus Horribilis speech. She arrived with a sore throat because of the smoke from the Windsor fire. And the combination of the Windsor fire and Windsor symbolising, in a sense, British royalty. What is the hold of it? With the sadness of the divorces in her family, she certainly felt it, but she also knew how to cope with it. Her faith was everything to her. It sustained her, a positive attitude, outlook on the world.
Giles, thank you so much. Perhaps we'll talk to you later this evening as well.
And it's now 28 minutes to 9, just after 8:30. This is a special programme from BBC News on the announcement of the death of Elizabeth II. And let's have a summary of the news of this evening from Chris Aldridge.
Queen Elizabeth II has died at the age of 96. Buckingham Palace said Britain's longest-serving monarch passed away peacefully at her Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire this afternoon. In a statement, Clarence House confirmed that the new king, the Queen's eldest son, would be known as King Charles III. He has said the death of his much-loved mother was a moment of great sadness for him and his family, and that her loss would be felt throughout the world. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, said the passing of the second Elizabethan age was a huge shock to the nation and to the world. Ms Truss paid tribute to the woman who appointed her Prime Minister 2 days ago, calling her a rock on which modern Britain was built. The Scottish and Welsh First Ministers Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford, as well as the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, have sent their deepest condolences. Leaders from around the world have paid tribute. President Biden said the Queen was a stateswoman of unmatched dignity who defined an era. President Zelensky said Ukraine sent its condolences to the UK and the Commonwealth for its irreparable loss. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canadians would always cherish her wisdom, compassion and warmth. Flags are flying at half-mast on buildings from London to New Zealand.
Chris, thank you. Well, it was at Balmoral that the Queen died. She died peacefully, the palace told us in a statement, but Buckingham Palace was her London home, and our colleague Paddy O'Connell is there now. It's dark now, Paddy, but are people continuing to come?
Yes, this very much is the scene for other big royal moments, and of course this is the once in 70-year royal moment. But there is always an advance party. But what, Michelle, is so noticeable from the hundreds around me is how young people are. I suppose you could say there's the I was there people. There are people who are coming out with their phones for selfies saying I was there tonight. But then there's another group of people you meet, the I was there people, the people who think the Queen was their life. It's dawned on me there's two different types of people here, many different emotions, but the young people here are sharing with the people with different generations, and the older people are contemplating what on earth their life means without her, because of course, 15 prime ministers, one head of state is statistic, but to be British and to try and understand it, it's very difficult sometimes, isn't it? So the people I meet think that she was helping them understand, and then now and again the crowds cheer. There's a spontaneous attempt every now and again to chant her name and to 3 cheers. Let me just see if you can hear it. It's just petering out in the rain. You can probably hear my umbrella. Earlier, here are 2 people I met in the crowds. One woman from Bath who'd been here just a few months ago in happier times. And first, Lord Lloyd Webber.
Just standing almost where we were when we did the concert for the Jubilee, and it's just completely and utterly overwhelming, really, that this has happened. It's like she was immortal.
And part of your family.
And part of everybody's family, not just mine. She was the incredible inspiration for not just Britain, the Commonwealth, but for the world.
Obviously, it's difficult to find words, and you're a man who thinks in music, but there was so much music here so recently, and she was very pleased with it. She stood on this balcony to rapturous applause.
Well, all one can say is that she's been an incredible supporter of almost every form of the arts in her time, and nobody will see the like of this incredible Queen ever again.
You're clutching some flowers that you brought down. What do you intend to lay them and go away, or will you stay?
Of course. What we've just come down today to pay respects to the most remarkable, extraordinary woman, and nobody will ever see the like of her again.
It's strange because you're not related to the person, but it feels like someone you care about really deeply has died, because she's been part of the fabric of everybody's lives, whether you were a monarchist or not, for pretty much everyone who's alive's life.
Did it feel an instinctive thing to get some flowers and bring them to the gates of Buckingham Palace?
Yes, it feels very strange because I came here for the Jubilee and was just looking at some of the video content and how happy and it seems tried to say glorious, but that's how it felt, and now for something completely different.
So the position I'm in as your eyes and ears at the palace is that I have my back to Green Park, and I'm looking at the Victoria Memorial, the memorial to the previous longest-serving monarch, and opposite it, half-lit, uplit, is the pillars of Buckingham Palace with the Union flag flying at half-mast. It's umbrellas, appropriately enough, and uncertainty would be 2 words I will remember from being here. And another U word just dawns on me. 2 ladies I just met from Uganda tell me that the phones are alive with everyone calling in, paying their respects to the family members here. Just a reminder of your other guests are saying. There may have been a debate in Britain about the future of the monarchy, and there may very well be one to come. But what's coming to me loud and clearly from the people who've come here by foot in the rain is they want to show their respect, their love and admiration, and the calls are coming into these 2 ladies, and they just thought they'd come here and bring the flag of Uganda and put it at the gates. So there you have umbrella, uncertainty, and the flag of Uganda, the latest update.
Paddy, thank you very much. And earlier when you were talking about the spontaneous cheering outside the palace, we could hear it. So we got the sense of that being a part of what's happening there as well. Thank you.
Paddy using words to describe what's going on there. Let's think of another word now, faith, because in her famous 1947 radio broadcast, when the Queen spoke of dedicating her life to service, she finished by saying, "God help me to make good my vow. Her long reign was shaped by public religion, but also by a private faith, a model on which to base a life of sacrifice, service and compassion. With her accession to the throne, the Queen became Defender of the Faith and Supreme Governor of the Church of England. And this was symbolised at her coronation in 1953 by the 16th Duke of Norfolk.
Will you maintain and preserve inviolable the settlement of the Church of England and the doctrine, worship, discipline and government thereof as by law established in England? And will you preserve unto the bishops and clergy of England and to the churches there committed to their charge all such rights and privileges as by law do or shall appertain to them or any of them?
All this I promise to do.
Well, it's very clear from the Queen's words and deeds that her faith was not limited to the public demands of her role, but was a personal conviction. The role of religion as a guide in her life was a frequent theme in her Christmas messages, including this one in 2014.
For me, the life of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, whose birth we celebrate today, is an inspiration and an anchor in my life. A role model of reconciliation and forgiveness, he stretched out his hands in love, acceptance, and healing. Christ's example has taught me to seek to respect and value all people of whatever faith or none.
That one from 2014. Let's hear another piece of archive here. 2002. Now, that was a year that saw the death of her mother, Queen Elizabeth, and sister, Princess Margaret. And she spoke of the comfort she'd drawn from faith.
I know just how much I rely on my own faith to guide me through the good times and the bad. Each day is a new beginning. I know that the only way to live my life is to try to do what is right, to take the long view, to give of my best in all that the day brings, and to put my trust in God.
Well, we're joined now by Archbishop Vincent Nichols, Archbishop of Westminster, head of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales. Archbishop, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
How will you remember the Queen?
Well, very much in the mode of the words that we just heard. For me, too, I think her declaration of the substantive nature of her Christian faith was always a great inspiration. And my memory is quite long. I remember the coronation. I remember the bar of chocolates and the mug that we got as children. And it goes right through to the year before last when I sat next to her at dinner at Windsor Castle, and we talked about her faith and her journey to Australia, and the corgis came to be fed. So I have a long, long memory, but at the heart of it is her ability to express her faith in a way that offended nobody but inspired everybody.
And did you feel that was important? It was clearly important to her, but was it also important in setting a tone in a country where we have seen increasing secularism?
Oh, I think so. And I think she understood that perfectly well. And she almost never failed in those key moments when she was addressing the nation, in which she knew, knives and forks would be put down to watch the Queen. She knew she had people's attention, and she chose always to give this gentle reminder of the importance of having a horizon which goes beyond the immediate.
And we heard, didn't we, in her own words the faith seeing her through personal loss, bereavement, trials.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, like the grandmother of any family, she had a fair share of tragedy and difficulty in family life, even in these last few years. But she kept a steadfastness together with an openness, I think. Those last words that you quoted, that her faith teaches her an openness to others, even those who are very different. And my goodness, that's a lesson we need in our society today, when we're tempted so quickly to close people down.
Archbishop Vincent Nichols, thank you very much. And the Queen's approach to faith was also one that acknowledged and celebrated religious diversity and tolerance in the UK and across the Commonwealth. She did engage with other faiths in the UK as well. And we are joined in the studio by Chief Rabbi Mervis, the Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth. Welcome to you, Chief Rabbi.
Good evening.
Your memories of the Queen?
This is an exceptionally sad day for our country, for the Commonwealth, and for the world. I was privileged to meet Her Majesty the Queen on many occasions, and what I found in her was somebody who didn't just have an important title. She was a great leader. She was a person with goodness from the heart. In our tradition, we would refer to her as a mensch, a wonderful human being who genuinely cared for others. She was an intensely and deeply faithful person with a keen interest in other faiths and a desire to guarantee that our freedom of religious expression would always be preserved. So I found myself engaged on many occasions in lovely conversations with her. And in her, we in the Jewish community saw her as somebody who had a special relationship with us. She was a patron of our Council of Christians and Jews. She very much championed the idea of interfaith relations. She very much wanted to guarantee that Holocaust Memorial would be a key feature of British life. I had the privilege of accompanying her to the Belsen concentration camp, where I saw how deeply she and Prince Philip were moved on that particular occasion. In Windsor Castle, on one occasion, she showed me a Torah scroll that she had received as a gift, which came from the former Czechoslovakia. It had been rescued from the Holocaust. And she shared stories of visits to synagogues around the world. I remember particularly her describing her visit to the Paradesi synagogue in India in a state visit in 1997, and she described the beautiful floor and the architecture. She had this natural, deep interest, unprompted, and it was palpable.
And in synagogues right across this country, prayers are said for the Queen. I've been at many synagogue services where it's par for the course.
Absolutely. Every single Sabbath and festival, we recite a prayer for the Queen and the royal family. At every single celebration in our community, we toast the Queen and the royal family. In fact, one of my most significant tasks this evening is to issue a new prayer for the royal family to be ready for this coming Sabbath.
And did you find her not just interested and mindful, but knowledgeable about Judaism?
Very much so. Yes. She was a person who was exceptionally modest and humble, but you could see that she remembered everything that she had heard. She would compare different faiths, and she would express this genuine interest with a keen desire to guarantee our right to preserve and to acting the tenets of our faith. And for that, we will forever be enormously indebted to her.
Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, thank you.
Now, as head of state, the Queen, and we've been discussing this in this special programme, the Queen had an important constitutional role and worked closely with the Prime Minister of the day. Now, the first of her 15 Prime Ministers was Sir Winston Churchill, a man who'd fought for Queen and country during the Boer War, when the monarch in question was Queen Victoria. When Elizabeth's father, George VI, died in 1952, Churchill gave a moving tribute to the King and offered words of encouragement to his new Queen.
I, whose youth was passed in the august, unchallenged and tranquil glories of the Victorian era, may well feel a thrill in invoking once more the prayer and the anthem. God save the Queen.
Churchill speaking in 1952. Well, Sir John Major became her 9th Prime Minister in 1990 and joins us now. And Sir John, a very sad day for the nation.
It's a very sad day. And I think the sadness will grow as people realise quite what it is we have lost. It was a very remarkable life that she's lived, and I think children today who may not understand its significance will remember in their old age this particular day and this particular event. It is that big in our history. She is truly beyond any question, one of the most remarkable monarchs we have ever had.
And remarkable both in the duration of her reign, but also the way she conducted herself through it.
I think both of those things are true, but I think it goes beyond that. It also goes into the example that she set. The example was, we heard a few moments ago from Churchmen, Her Majesty didn't parade her Christianity, except in one respect, she lived it. She was, by instinct, a unifier. She disliked division. She tended to try and bring people together. And in that way, she was very remarkable, and she set an extraordinary example. If you travel anywhere around the world, and you hear people in another language, in a far-off land, speak of the Queen, there is a very high likelihood that they're speaking of our Queen. That is the extent of the reach of Queen Elizabeth II.
So, John, tell us about your relationship with her, your political and personal relationship with her.
Well, I was fortunate enough to see her for nearly 7 years on a one-to-one basis with the weekly meetings of Prime Ministers and the Queen. Later, I had other relationships that involved seeing the Queen. I was chairman of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust for 10 years, set up to honour her 60 years on the throne. And I had a lot to do with her about what we should do with the charity and how the charity worked. And there were several things that struck one. Yes, she was the Queen. Yes, there was a degree of majesty about the position of her as a Queen, but she was very human. On a one-to-one basis, immensely human, empathetic, in my experience, always well briefed, and rather a wise woman. I suppose if she had had to choose, she would have been happy being a country woman with her dogs and her horses, with a love of our remarkable armed forces. But she was Queen, and she understood the duties that required and the example that needed to be set. And it would be difficult for anyone to say that she didn't perform that role in an exemplary manner for so very many years. Most people retire at or around 70. The Queen was working, and publicly working, until 2 days ago, at the age of 96. There are very few people who would have had a working life remotely of that length or of that productivity, or who were still showing an enthusiasm for what they had to do after having done it so long. These are extraordinary attributes that our country has taken for granted because of the remarkable life we have sadly just lost.
Working right up to the end. Obviously, all but 15 people can only imagine what those weekly meetings are like. You're not going to break the confidence of those meetings. But we do imagine her, I suppose, asking probing questions rather than telling you what to do.
Yes, she did. I'm certainly not going to tell you what we discussed, except to say it's hard to imagine what we didn't discuss. Everything was on the agenda. It wasn't all serious. There was a lot of fun in those meetings as well. I don't mean they were frivolous and silly with silly jokes, of course not. But I mean there was a lot of dry humour in the events that we discussed. And there was also a great deal of really solid substance. The Queen was a wise lady, and she was more experienced than any three of her prime ministers added together in terms of the state papers she had read and seen. And her historic memory of what had happened when something had been tried before was longer than that of the civil service. It was extraordinary. And that was a very valuable attribute that prime ministers sometimes found they called upon, albeit unexpectedly, in their meetings with the Queen.
And so, John, you were her prime minister in some very difficult years for her, the divorce of Diana and Charles. Did you find yourself giving her counsel at that time?
I'm not going to go into details, except to say everything was on the table and the discussions were very frank. And I found them immensely useful when I was in difficulties. I hope in some way the Queen might have found them of some small use when she was in difficulties.
So, John, this is a very important moment for the nation. There is going to be a lot of sober reflection over the next days and weeks as we leave the Elizabethan era. How would you like the nation to be conducting itself as we remember Elizabeth and think about the way our nation has changed over the course of her reign?
Well, I would like the nation to conduct themselves with the same dignity that the Queen has for 70 years. I think that would be the right way to do it. Let us, by all means, spill out our emotions and let everyone know how much we valued this remarkable woman that we have just lost. I think that is entirely a natural thing to do. Let us consider how we can learn from the lessons that she paraded before us day after day during those many years in her monarchy. She was in every way extraordinary. And she was so extraordinary, you didn't really realise she was extraordinary because she was a part of our lives. She was at different times of our ages, rather like our mother, rather like our grandmother, rather like our great-grandmother. And that is extraordinary when you consider the sheer majesty of royalty throughout our history, that her personality should have fallen into every warp and weft of our lives in a way that we appreciate. I think that will become even more apparent as people look back. The second Elizabethan era has been remarkable. In all our long history, I do not believe we have ever had 70 years in which there was so much dramatic change, both for our nation as a whole and for the lives people in our nation lived. The Queen presided over that, evolved with that, lived with that, worked with that, and maintained the affection of the nation over that period. And one final thought occurs to me about that. Can you name any other public figure that you have ever seen who might have retained the affection of a nation in the way the Queen has done over a 70-year period? If such a person exists, I can't imagine who they might be.
It's a good question. Sir John Major, thank you so much for joining us.
And now to Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent. It is a remarkable life, and also the fact that 48 hours before the end of her life, there she was, pictured on her feet, carrying out her duty. And when the end came, it was at home.
It was at home, and it was at one of her favourite places, if not her favourite place, Balmoral. And of course, you mentioned that picture from 2 days ago when she met the incoming Prime Minister, Liz Truss. We've now discovered, or we've been told, the timings of what happened today as far as the Prime Minister being informed. She was apparently informed at 4:30. Now, that was about 2 hours before the news was brought to us by Buckingham Palace. The Cabinet Secretary told her while she was working. We, of course, heard her give the address outside Downing Street. She then spoke to the new King. It is worth pondering as we think about the longevity of this reign. She is the first Prime Minister in 70 years to speak to two different monarchs. That is the length of the service that Queen Elizabeth gave.
And then earlier today we had these, what must have been very difficult journeys for members of the family to get to Balmoral.
Extraordinarily. I mean, they will have known the seriousness of the Queen's condition. They will have been informed of that because the changes in their plans are not made lightly. So they knew where they were going and why they were going there. And we knew that because of their journeys that this was a much more serious situation than anything might have occurred before. And so they made those journeys. Perhaps the most serious of those journeys, of course, was one of the briefest, which was Prince Charles's. He was in the area of Balmoral. But he will have known, he will have feared that this was the moment perhaps he was going to say farewell to his mother, to the Queen, and of course assume the duties of the monarch. And sure enough, he did. And he is now, of course, King Charles.
Yes, and then we become accustomed to calling him His Majesty the King, and Camilla being the Queen Consort.
Yes, and what a change that is. I mean, not just King Charles, but His Majesty. For so many years, for so many decades, it has been Her Majesty. And now it is the first of so many changes to come. We'll see those rippling down hours, days and weeks to come. We will see those changes come. But the first one is the name. It doesn't quite trip off the tongue yet. It is still strange. And we don't even refer yet to the late Queen. We're still talking about the Queen. But it is now the King and the Queen Consort. And we will be hearing, no doubt, from him in the coming days.
It's a day of enormous significance. There's a lot for people to absorb, but but this is a life to celebrate as well as a passing to mourn.
Absolutely. And that word celebration was used by the Prime Minister when she spoke in Downing Street. There are many people who are shocked, many people outside Buckingham Palace, very, very upset now. But again, over these coming days, there will be much to talk about, to remember, to celebrate, to commemorate, as well as much to mourn.
Johnny, thank you very much. You're listening to BBC News broadcasting across our UK networks and on the BBC World Service as we mark the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She died at Balmoral, her home in Scotland, earlier today. This is BBC News.
We will be continuing to remember the Queen's life. We'll be hearing from those who have observed close up her long reign. But let's now have a summary of the news this evening from Chris Aldridge.
Queen Elizabeth II has died at Balmoral at the age of 96 after reigning for 70 years. Buckingham Palace said she passed away peacefully this afternoon. Senior royals had gathered at Balmoral after concerns were expressed about her health earlier today. The Prince of Wales, her eldest son, who's now become King Charles III, said this was a moment of great sadness for him and his family and that her loss would be deeply felt around the world. The new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, emerged from Downing Street on news of the Queen's death. She described her as the rock on which modern Britain was built.
She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. Her life of service stretched beyond most of our living memories. In return, she was loved and admired by the people in the United Kingdom and all around the world. She has been a personal inspiration to me and to many Britons. Her devotion to duty is an example to us all.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said the country had lost the person whose steadfast loyalty, service and humility had helped us make sense of who we were. He said the Queen left behind a truly extraordinary legacy that was found in almost every corner of our national life, as well as the lives of so many nations around the world. Pope Francis said he was deeply saddened. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, sent his deepest condolences.
For the vast majority of us, the late Queen has been simply the Queen, the only Queen. Above all else, our Queen. As we mourn her loss, we should also treasure her life, our longest serving and greatest ever monarch. Above the clashes of politics, she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what it agreed upon.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said the Queen's life was one of extraordinary dedication and service, and her death was a profoundly sad moment for the UK, the Commonwealth and the world. The Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford said the Queen firmly upheld the values and traditions of the British monarchy. The former Prime Minister Theresa May remembered her weekly audiences with the Queen.
It was a conversation with somebody who was immensely knowledgeable and understanding of the issues, what was going on in the government and around the rest of the world. She knew many of the world leaders that one was meeting as Prime Minister, but also she had a great sense of humour as well.
Crowds have been gathering at the gates of Buckingham Palace. Our home editor, Mark Easton, is there.
This is a crowd of every generation and every background. There are a lot of young people, a lot of people from ethnic minorities, and she was a queen that was able to be a figurehead for people from whatever background. We've got tens of thousands of people here already. Some people, I have to say, are close to tears. This was a very personal relationship with a woman who embodied something very special about their country. She was, I think, a solid and immovable piece that sort of defined the nation's image of itself.
World leaders have been remembering the Queen as a beacon of calm and stability, spanning her record-breaking reign. President Biden and his wife Jill said she was a stateswoman of unmatched dignity and constancy. The French President Emmanuel Macron described her as a friend of France. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi wrote on Twitter that the Queen would be remembered as a stalwart of our times. The Italian Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, praised her for her spirit of service. At the United Nations, the Security Council held a minute's silence. The Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, said she was admired around the world for her grace, dignity and dedication. The Irish Prime Minister, Micheál Martin, said the Queen's state visit in 2011 played a key role in the normalisation of relations between the two countries. The Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, paid this emotional tribute.
She was one of my favourite people in the world, and I will miss her so. She was our Queen for almost half of Canada's existence, and she had an obvious, deep, and abiding love and affection for Canadians. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more.
Workers have been called off in response to the Queen's death. Stoppages were due to be held on the 15th and 17th of September. And Royal Mail workers, members of the Communication Workers Union who walked out this morning, have cancelled the second day of their strike tomorrow.
Chris, thank you. Chris Aldridge there. Now it's 9:05 here in the UK. We are digesting the news of the death of Elizabeth II. Some little bits of news about what is happening at the moment. Flags will be flying at half-mast on UK government buildings in tribute to the Queen from now until the morning after her funeral. Churches, I'm seeing this from the Press Association, are being urged to toll their bells across England on Friday, tomorrow, to mark the death of the Queen. We're staying on air as we report and reflect on the news this evening. Johnny Diamond is with me. Johnny, a lot of wheels of state are now going to be turning.
Yes, and you get a sense of the scale of that from what we've just learned about the timetable of the Prime Minister being informed. She was informed 2 hours before the statement came out. That is because this is a personal occasion, certainly for members of the royal family and of course for so many other people across the country. But this is a very important state occasion as well. And it is an occasion across the world because the Queen was not just the Queen of the United Kingdom, but the Queen of more than a dozen other countries as well. And all of them had to be informed before the news was made public. And I think that speaks to why there was this 2 hour wait between the British Prime Minister being informed and, of course, the rest of us hearing about this. So yes, we will see the machinery of state swinging into action. I mean, this is not an unplanned event, it should be said. There are lots of plans in place, and we will start to see plans go in not just for a period of mourning, but also for the new king as well. This is going to be a period unlike any other, really, in modern British history, a period where the nation and the state looks back in remembrance, but also looks forward and settles in a new monarch. And then, of course, that ripples down through the rest of the royal family. And then physical changes from everything from stamps to banknotes and coins. All of that starts to happen as well at some speed, because there is always a sovereign, there is always a monarch, and there is now a new one.
Johnny, thank you.
Let's take a look back now at the Queen's life, right back to her early life, in fact, because in 1940, at the height of the Blitz during World War II, the then Princess Elizabeth and her younger sister Margaret were moved from Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle to escape the bombing. And it was in October of that year, at the age of 14, that she made her very first public speech, and it was on the BBC's Children's Hour.
I can truthfully say to you all that we children at home are full of cheerfulness and courage. We are trying to do all we can to help our gallant sailors, soldiers and airmen. And we are trying too to bear our own share of the danger and sadness of war. We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well, for God will care for us and give us victory and peace. And when peace comes, remember, it will be for us the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place.
The Queen there at the age of 14. Well, let's jump a few years. Her devotion to duty continued. Let's go to when she was 21, fulfilling a promise she made. Fulfilling a promise she made.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Thinking even further back in her life, she was 10 when she became heir to the throne. That is how old she was when her father became king after the abdication of her uncle, Edward VIII. And then towards the end of the Second World War, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, training as a mechanic and driver. She wore the ATS uniform on VE Day in 1945, and she and her sister left Buckingham Palace to mingle with the celebrating crowds.
We cheered the King and Queen on the balcony and then walked miles through the streets. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief. I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life.
Well, no memories of the Queen, well, any memories of the Queen invite memories, of course, of her consort, Philip. In 1947, she married him, former Prince of Greece, huge source of support, as she acknowledged in a speech marking their golden wedding anniversary in 2007.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim or we shall ever know.
Well, it was just over 4 years after she was married that news came of the death of her father, King George VI. And that, of course, was the moment that she acceded to the throne just over 70 years ago now. Let's speak to Grant Harold, who's a former royal butler. He worked for the Prince of Wales, as he was, now the Queen, and in that capacity met Her Majesty. Grant, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Tell us about your experience of meeting the Queen in the time that you worked for the then Prince.
I think for me, it was a huge honour because when I was a youngster, I remember watching a documentary about the royal family. I think it was in the early 90s, and there was a scene where I remember seeing the Queen and she was dancing. I said to my late father, "How do I meet this lady, or how do I dance with this lady? You know, as you do." And I remember he said to me, "Well, you either have to work for them or marry into them." And I did think, well, who could I marry? But I did actually write to her on a few occasions after that when I was a teenager, and then lastly, when I was about 26, was when I joined the royal household, and then I think it wasn't too long after when I started kind of coming face to face with her on different occasions. But one of my favourite memories was at Balmoral Castle, where I actually did get to dance with her in the room that I watched in this programme 11 years before.
How extraordinary.
I know, it's one of those kind of moments that even to this very day, I still pinch myself and think, did that actually happen?
What was the occasion?
It was the Gillies Ball, which is exactly what was on this programme, the Gillies Ball, where the Queen would, it wasn't unusual for her to dance with family members and staff members. And it was, for me, it was extraordinary. I was so nervous. But before the actual dance, I remember as she was then, the Duchess of Cornwall, I said to her, she noticed I was nervous and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm really worried." I said, "Because I think tonight I'll dance with the Queen." And she said, "Why do you say that?" And I said, "It was a documentary many years ago." And I said, "Here I am in the room." And I remember the Duchess said it was 150 odd people in this room. It's highly unlikely. And no sooner than she said that, the dance we were doing finished, I turned round and the Queen was directly behind me. It was almost like fate, which resulted in this dance, which was amazing. I mean, really good fun. She had a very funny, I don't think people really understood that. She had a funny way about her. She had when I say that, a wonderful sense of humour. I mean, amazing sense of humour. A naughty humour that I think some listeners might have witnessed or seen over the years in different programmes or maybe even in person. But I was lucky enough to actually be with her. And many people have called her a grandmother of the nation. Well, I used to jokingly say she was like a naughty granny, because she would do, in the most respectful way, because she would do or say things. And I used to think, I would love to have you as my grandmother, because you're just amazing. Such an amazing lady,
And tell us about Balmoral and her life at Balmoral, because it was important to her. And obviously she's at this summer, she's at a very advanced stage of her life. But earlier than that, what were her days at Balmoral in these summer holidays she spent there like?
Oh, I mean, because I used to travel up there with the Prince as he was then, and we often, I'd go out either horse riding or walking, and you'd often bump into. I mean, in fact, I even had some wonderful stories about. I think the post office van one day came face to face with the Queen. Didn't realise it was the Queen, and made the Queen reverse back up one of the lanes. The Queen was very much one of the locals there. She went into the local shops back in the day. She was. The locals protected her fiercely as well, if I can say that. They were very protective with respect from journalists and things, because obviously they respected that was their private home. Some people don't know that Balmoral was only one of 2 homes the Queen actually owns. Sandringham and Balmoral are privately owned by the monarch. And also, it's somewhere that I think she felt she could get away from everything. So part of me is kind of thinking... I don't know, but, obviously with everything that's happened over the last few days, I kind of wonder if she maybe knew that she wasn't in the best of health. And I kind of wonder if it had been planned that she wanted... I mean, who knows? We'll never really know. But I kind of wonder if that was a choice, maybe that's what she wanted, was to be there when her time came, because she obviously loved the country. She adored every corner of the country. But Scotland, she, like Queen Victoria, she did call it her Highland paradise. And it was somewhere that she had many, many wonderful memories, also with Prince Philip in the little cottage in the grounds that they used to go to.
Within the grounds of Balmoral?
Craignagown, a little cottage, very humble, if I can say that, compared to the castle. But that's where they used to... It was described to me that that's where they would play Mr. and Mrs. And obviously that was where they could just be themselves. From what I was told, I never witnessed it, but she would be in the kitchen cooking away and things, and he would kind of lay the table and things. So it was very much a chance for them to be just a normal couple. But see, I believe that because I've seen footage over the years as well, sadly not personally, but where the Queen would feed the corgis herself, when she could. So she was very much, I think people assumed that because she had people like myself around to kind of look after the family, they assumed that they don't do things, but she was very much hands-on. She would happily, and Prince Philip and Prince Charles, they would very much go and do things on their own.
Yeah, a chance to get away from the royal butler.
It was get away from all the royal staff and just have some. So in fact, they were quite insistent. I remember if there was picnics and things, we wouldn't go with them. There'd be no reason, and they would just do it on their own, which I thought was lovely. But I think today, with especially obviously this evening, I've been in between interviews, I've been reflecting, and I just think I'm really lucky that listen to other people talking about the Queen and people saying how they wish they'd met her, and I just think, I was so lucky to have known her at one point and to have been with her and in rooms of my own and had amazing conversations, and something that I will now always treasure.
Yeah, and to have seen her in what was clearly one of her favourite settings and off duty and relaxed, it's very special.
Yes. Yeah.
Grant, thank you so much for sharing your memories with us. Grant Harold.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And it is lovely to hear memories of people who really knew her. Funny, mischievous. I think we'd all like to think of her that way, but we didn't really know. Robert Lacey, royal historian, author of The Queen, A Life in Brief. Does that resonate with you, the way that Grant Harold was describing it?
Wasn't it lovely to hear him talking frankly about talking to the Queen, whereas all these prime ministers we've heard on, well, they've said great and worthy things, but they won't tell us a thing about her, will they? No. She did have and everybody talks about her wonderful sense of humour and never gives an example. And I've got one, which comes from a Privy Council meeting when apparently Claire, in the days of Claire Short, Labour government, and early days of mobile phones when people weren't quite sure how to use them. And suddenly her mobile phone went off during the Privy Council meeting, and she fumbled with it, of course, and the Queen said, "Oh dear, I hope that wasn't someone important." And of course, the joke there comes from her modesty. And I don't know if Grant told the story of how... yes, she loved one of the... I think to get a bit solemn, I think the fact that she died in this corner of the United Kingdom, where she did, as he says, enjoy being normal, is very significant. And she did like walking around, and there's another of these stories how she was with a detective walking along, and an American tourist said, "Have you met the Queen?" And she said, "No, I haven't," pointing to the detective, "but he has."
Those are very good stories.
Somebody's added to this story, I don't know if it's true, that he then said to the Queen, Can you take a selfie of me? I myself don't believe this final bit. And so she happily took the camera and took a picture of the tourist with the detective. And gave the camera back. And when he'd left, she apparently said to the detective, "Well, he's going to kick himself when he finds out the truth of all that." So, I mean, I think what's beautiful about her humour was it did reflect her modesty about her being an ordinary person.
There was some documentary footage that was doing the rounds not that long ago of her working the room at an international reception with a remarkable number of leaders and important international figures there. I think this is in the era of Ted Heath, but she was very good at making conversation, bringing people into the conversation, keeping it light, not letting it get too heavy, not making it banal. I mean, it is quite a skill, really, isn't it?
She was a real professional. And this opening phrase of hers that always got satirised in the shows, "Have you come far?" was in fact very clever. Because if you say to somebody, "How are you?" they either don't know what to say, or they'll launch into far more than you need. If you say to somebody, "Have you come far?" that gives them a precise answer to give. And then, so I've come from Coventry, and then that gives her a response.
A cue.
I remember when I was last in Coventry, XYZ, she would say. And so she was able to give that particular person something special to them.
Yeah. Now, Robert, royal families, special to different nations, their own royal families, obviously there is a relationship between them, and many of them have been commenting tonight. The Spanish royal family have sent a telegram, for example, Your Majesty, dearest Charles, deeply saddened by the sorrowful news. Compare the British royal family under Queen Elizabeth to the way other nations' royal families developed, because we often heard, and there were times when people, we want a bicycling monarchy, something much more down to earth. Talk us through that.
Well, I think what's interesting about the bicycling monarchy, which is a reference to the Netherlands monarchy, I think anti-monarchists might reflect that some of the so-called most intelligent and rational countries in Europe have kept monarchies. I mean, the Scandinavian countries, so very modern and democratic, but they have all understood the value of the essence of our system that we heard, I thought, Keir Starmer talking about rather well, that the politicians are there to represent what we disagree about, and she represented what we agree about. And I thought it was a wonderful moment at the Jubilee when Boris Johnson, as he came up the steps, got booed, not because I got anything against Boris Johnson, but because it illustrated this point. Inside the church, we were celebrating what we agree about. Here was a very divisive, though also a very successful figure that people didn't agree about. And we saw the whole, that's a lesson in British constitutional history, but I think it did revolve around her being an ordinary person. One last thing, I mean, the British monarchy is said to be the most expensive in the whole of Europe and was under her. On the other hand, it had more working figures in it so when you divided the cost by the amount of engagements they did, in fact, someone like Prince Richard of Gloucester would be the 10th hardest working figure in the whole of Europe. And of course, the Queen, Prince Charles and Princess Anne were right at the top there, with those two taking their example from her, their mother.
Robert, thank you for that. Robert Lacey.
There are so many wonderful tributes that have been paid to her. It's quite hard to choose between them, but I'm going to just mention this one from Justin Trudeau, who just simply called her one of my favourite people in the world, and he'd known her as a child as well as later a world leader. But let's go back to Scotland and the importance of Scotland in the Queen's life and her love for Scotland, because Sarah Smith, our former Scotland editor, is at Holyrood now. How would you describe the importance of Scotland in her life, Sarah?
Well, she obviously was very, very attached to Scotland, and as a result, very many people here reciprocated that feeling. So just a year ago, at the Holyrood Scottish Parliament, when the Queen was there opening the session, she spoke specifically of her deep and abiding affection for what she called this wonderful country. And then she went on to speak about how her and Prince Philip had shared some of their happiest memories in Scotland. And her attachment to Scotland goes way back. She visited frequently as a child because her mother's ancestral home at Glamis Castle is just north of Dundee. And we know from letters that she wrote how much she enjoyed her time there. And of course there were the very, very frequent family holidays to Balmoral, but lots of official engagements in Scotland as well. For a week in June every year, it's known as Holywood Week or Royal Week. And the Queen is in residence at her official residence, Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, and she threw a garden party to invite thousands of people who lived in Scotland to it, and undertook all sorts of engagements then as well, all across the country. There were some very, very grand occasions, of course, that she attended in Scotland. But then just last year, she and Prince William had a much more humble engagement when they toured around the Iron Brew factory in Cumbernauld. So she saw all walks of Scottish life. And it was because she was so clearly dedicated to this part of her kingdom that Scots also returned that affection in very large measure.
Remind us, Sarah, of what she said in those days, very, very close to the independence referendum in 2014, when she was speaking to people, about the imminent choice they were about to make, and then her comments were widely reported.
Yes, so she was visiting Crathy Kirk, which is the Church of Scotland church that she used to go to whenever she was staying at Balmoral. And she stopped and spoke to some well-wishers outside just a few days before the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. And she said that she hoped people would think very carefully before they cast their vote in that referendum. And that was interpreted in many quarters as being a signal that she did not want Scotland to become independent, and she hoped that people would not vote for it. That was denied by the palace. And of course, it was very carefully worded so that it didn't actually express any opinion about Scottish independence. But it's notable, I think, when we think of the years that we have been debating the possibility of Scottish independence. Throughout all that time, the SNP have been very careful to stress that if Scotland were ever to become an independent country, the Queen would have remained as its head of state, because they know that even through this huge constitutional upheaval that they were proposing, they could lose votes if they were to suggest to Scots that their ties to the royal family would be lessened if Scotland were an independent country. So that gives you a measure of how Scotland felt towards the Queen, because the SNP were so worried that if they were to say that the Queen would no longer reign over Scots, that they might not want to vote for independence.
Sarah, thank you very much. Sarah Smith there.
We were talking about faith earlier in this programme. Let's stay in Scotland now, because as monarch, the Queen was supreme governor of the Church of England. That isn't the case for the Church of Scotland, though she would take part in worship there. She appointed chaplains from the Kirk to the royal household in Scotland. We can talk to the Reverend Dr. Ian Greenshields, who's moderator of the Church of Scotland. Dr. Greenshields, thank you for joining us. And your thoughts this evening?
Very sad, and also very surprised. I think this is something that we knew the Queen's health was obviously diminishing, but I think it was very sudden too.
And the relationship she had to your church, so as I understand it, when attending church services in Scotland, she does it so as an ordinary member, but she had a very inclusive notion of her role as defender of the faith of the Church of England.
Yes, she did. She was a very wise lady, though. She realised the unique situation that the Church of Scotland had in Scottish society. She honoured that. and yet she fully immersed herself in the life of the Kirk. She wanted to understand what the church was doing. She took a great interest in that. She assured us of her full support and assured us too that we were prayed for by her as we reciprocated that too. And so she was held in very high regard by the Church of Scotland and the ministers and members of the Church of Scotland.
And held in high regard more generally in Scotland. We were just hearing from Sarah Smith there. Do you find that as well?
I think so, yes. I think people may have various different views about independence in Scotland, but I'm pretty certain that the Queen was a very stable figure within all of our lives and somebody that we looked up to, admired, respected. I think within the church, we respected the fact that the Queen spoke very warmly about her faith as well. And so for all of us, faith or no faith, the Queen was somebody who was able to embrace all and did it very, very effectively. She was an incredibly wise lady, and